She thought it was humiliation. It was the only thing standing between her and death. At the most glamorous charity gala of the year, Mason Carter, a quiet, unremarkable driver, crossed a ballroom floor and kissed Ava Whitmore on the mouth in front of 500 witnesses. No warning, no explanation, just a man who saw something no one else did and made a choice in 3 seconds that would unravel a conspiracy years in the making. He nearly died for it. She nearly hated him for it, and neither of them would ever be the same. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this one travels. The Hargrove Grand had hosted presidents, foreign dignitaries, and more than a few people whose names appeared in federal indictments, sometimes all in the same evening. Tonight, the ballroom on the 42nd floor had been transformed into something out of a dream that cost real money to maintain. White orchids imported from Thailand cascading down long tables draped in ivory linen, a string quartet playing Debussy near the west windows, and 500 guests dressed in a combined net worth that could have funded a small nation's infrastructure for a decade. Mason Carter stood near the service corridor entrance with his hands loose at his sides and his jacket slightly too formal for a driver, slightly too plain for a guest. That was intentional. He had learned a long time ago that the most useful place to stand at any event was the space where people's eyes moved past you without stopping. He was watching the room the way he used to watch rooms for a living. Not the decorations, not the faces of the guests. He was watching the way people moved, the small deviations, the pauses, the moments when someone's body language stopped matching the social situation they were supposedly participating in. A woman near the bar laughing 2 beats too late. A man by the window whose attention kept cutting left instead of tracking the conversation in front of him. And the waiter near table 7 who had been standing in the same position for 11 minutes without serving a single thing. Mason noticed him at 8:47 p.m. By 8:52, he had identified 3 things. The man was not looking at the guests the way staff looked at guests. With the practiced, slightly bored attention of someone waiting to be useful, he was looking at one specific person. His left hand was held at an angle that suggested something in his jacket pocket, and he was not sweating despite the warmth of a room packed with bodies and lit by several hundred candles. Mason had worked long enough in close protection to know what it looked like when someone was doing a job. Ava Whitmore stood 20 feet away near the center of the room, accepting congratulations from a man whose name Mason had been given on a briefing sheet 2 months ago. Someone from the city's development council, mid-50s, almost certainly using this event to try to pitch her on a waterfront rezoning project that her father had blocked 3 times before his death. Ava was nodding with the expression of someone who had learned to appear interested while thinking about something else entirely. She was wearing a dark emerald gown that had probably been suggested by a stylist and accepted without much argument. Her dark hair was pinned back. She held a glass of champagne that had been sitting in her right hand for the last 4 minutes without being touched. She was not happy to be here. She had told Mason that directly, 2 hours earlier in the car, in the flat tone of someone who had stopped pretending a long time ago. "I hate these things. My father loved them. I never understood why." She had said it to the window, not to him, which meant she was not asking for a response. Mason had not given one. That was the shape of their working relationship, 2 months in, clean, professional, and conducted mostly in silence. Ava did not ask questions about him. He did not offer information. She was efficient, direct, and treated him with the brisk courtesy of someone who had been taught that staff deserved respect, but not intimacy. He showed up on time, drove well, and maintained the particular quality of invisibility that the job required. It worked. Most days, it was enough. He watched the waiter shift his weight. The man's eyes moved from Ava's face to her champagne glass with a precision that had nothing casual about it. Mason was already moving before he had fully processed the decision. He was not thinking about consequences. He was not thinking about his position or the scene it would cause, or what Ava Whitmore would think of him afterward. He had learned, in a different life, that hesitation in a moment like this was its own kind of choice, and usually the wrong one. He crossed the ballroom in long, unhurried strides, because urgency draws attention, and he did not want the man near table 7 to see him coming. He moved through the crowd the way water moves through stone, finding gaps, not forcing them. Someone turned and he angled around them. A server with a tray shifted left and he stepped right. He kept his eyes on Ava's glass. She was raising it toward her lips. The development council man had just delivered what was apparently a punchline, and she was smiling with her mouth and nothing else, and the champagne was 3 inches from her face. He stepped in front of her without stopping, cupped the side of her jaw with one hand to redirect her attention, and kissed her. Not performance, not gentle. A real kiss. The kind with pressure and intent. The kind that said, stop what you're doing and focus here. His other hand closed over the stem of the champagne glass and pulled it from her fingers in the same motion. The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a ripple. The people closest first, then the people who saw those people react, then the outer edges of the crowd going still as the information traveled in whispers and stares. The string quartet played 2 more bars before the violinist trailed off. Ava pulled back. Her face, when he saw it, was doing several things at once. The smile was gone. In its place was a kind of cold, bright fury that he suspected she had inherited from her father's side. The expression of someone who did not embarrass easily, but when they did, made sure the person responsible understood the full weight of that mistake. "What," she said very quietly, "do you think you are doing?" It was not a question. Her voice was level and precise. The development council man had taken 3 steps back. Around them, 500 people were trying to decide whether to stare openly or pretend they hadn't seen. Mason set the champagne glass down on a nearby table. He opened his mouth to answer her. What came out instead was a sharp, involuntary breath. The tingling had started in his lips the moment they made contact. A faint chemical burn, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't already primed to recognize it. He had recognized it. He had been hoping he was wrong. By the time he set the glass down, the tingling had moved to his tongue and the back of his throat, and his saliva glands were doing something they should not have been doing, and there was a heat behind his sternum that was not the heat of embarrassment. "Mason!" Ava's voice had changed. Something in her face had shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. She was watching him the way she sometimes watched financial documents, not with feeling, but with the particular focus of someone who had noticed something that did not add up. I need you to step away from the center of the room," he said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. "Right now, quietly. Don't look toward the service corridor." "What is happening?" "Ava." He had never used her first name before. The word came out with a weight that stopped her mid-sentence. "Please." She moved. He followed her, one hand at her elbow, not gripping, just present, toward the east side of the ballroom where a cluster of guests near the windows provided enough cover. His vision had a slight soft quality around the edges now, which he noted and filed away without allowing himself to react to it. His heart rate was elevated. His hands were steady. He was breathing carefully, through the nose, the way he'd been trained to manage physiological stress responses, and it was helping, and it was also not helping enough. "Tell me what's in that glass," Ava said. She had maneuvered them to the edge of the group near the windows, and her voice was barely above a murmur. Up close, her eyes were darker than he usually noticed. There was something behind the anger now, something that might, in worse light, have been frightened. "I don't know exactly," Mason said, "but the waiter who put it there has been standing near table 7 for 11 minutes without doing his job, and he spent most of that time watching you." She absorbed this. Her jaw tightened. "You kissed me to—" It was faster than explaining. "You were already raising the glass." She stared at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then something shifted in her face, a fractional softening that she immediately covered. "You took it into your mouth." "A small amount, probably. I don't know how much transferred before I pulled the glass." "And how do you feel right now?" He considered lying. He was good at it, had been once in a different context for professional reasons, but the honesty came out instead, the way it sometimes did when he was tired. "Not great?" Her hand closed around his arm, not the polite professional contact of an employer directing an employee. Something firmer than that, something that cost her something to do. "We're getting you out of here." "We need to locate— Now, Mason!" He let her move him, partly because she was right. mostly because his legs had decided in the last 30 seconds to begin a conversation with the rest of his body about whether they were going to continue cooperating, and he was not confident about the outcome of that conversation. They were at the elevator before the cramps started. The hospital was 40 minutes from the Hargrove Grand, and Mason did not remember all of them. He remembered Ava on the phone in the back seat of the car, not his car, a hired car, because she had taken his keys without asking and driven herself, which he would have objected to if objecting had felt achievable. She was talking to someone in a voice that he recognized from the brief period during which he had attended board briefings. Her dealing with a problem voice, efficient and without tremor. He could not make out the specific words. The streetlights were doing something interesting outside the window. He remembered her hand on his forearm, pressing 2 fingers to his pulse point, then releasing. The contact was clinical, not tender. She was checking something, but it was there. He remembered a stretcher and a ceiling with fluorescent lights, and a nurse asking him questions that he answered correctly, which impressed him under the circumstances. He did not remember the next 6 hours. The room he woke up in was small and smelled like industrial cleaning solution and the particular staleness of recirculated hospital air. There was an IV line in his left arm. The light through the window blinds had the gray quality of early morning, 5, maybe 6 a.m. His mouth tasted like chemicals and copper and the faint trace of something floral that he eventually identified as Ava Whitmore's perfume. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory. Headache, significant. Nausea, present, manageable. The burning in his throat had faded to a dull rawness. His hands, when he lifted them, were steady. The cardiac monitor beeped at a rhythm that sounded, to his admittedly limited self-diagnostic capability, like something that was not an emergency. He was alive. He had known he probably would be. He had taken in a very small amount, residue rather than the full dose, and had recognized the symptoms early enough to give the ER team something to work with. But there was always a gap between probably and definitely, and crossing from one side of that gap to the other did something to a person, even a person who had trained for years to be calm about risk. He thought about Ella. She had been at a sleepover at her friend Danica's house last night, a carefully orchestrated arrangement that he had confirmed twice and triple-checked the address for, because that was the kind of father he was. The kind who had learned that the world could move very fast and that children could not. She would be there until noon. She didn't know anything had happened. He needed to keep it that way. He needed to call her before noon. He needed to get out of this hospital. He needed, "You're awake." Ava was in the chair by the window. He hadn't seen her because she had been sitting very still, and because his initial inventory had been focused on himself rather than the room. She was still in the gown from the night before, though she had removed whatever had been holding her hair up, and it fell loose past her shoulders now. The emerald silk was wrinkled. There were shadows under her eyes that makeup had mostly concealed before and wasn't concealing anymore. She had been there all night. Mason processed this without saying anything for a moment. "You didn't have to stay," he said finally. "I'm aware of that. I would have been fine. You collapsed in my car. Fine is a generous word choice." She studied him with the same focused attention she had turned on him in the ballroom before everything went wrong. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I was." "That's not an answer." "Headache, throat, the rest is manageable." He shifted, trying to sit up. The IV line tugged at his arm. "Don't." She was out of the chair before the word was finished, pressing a hand flat against his shoulder. Not hard, but with enough conviction that he stopped. "The doctor said you need to lie still. They want to run more blood work when the morning shift comes in." "I have a daughter," he said. "She's at a sleepover. She gets picked up at noon. I need to... What's the address?" He looked at her. "Mason." She said his name the way he had said hers last night, with a weight that asked for cooperation rather than demanding it. "Give me the address. I'll arrange for someone to pick her up. Someone you trust or you don't, your choice. But you are not getting out of this bed at 6 a.m. with an IV in your arm because you're worried about a school pickup." He told her the address. She pulled out her phone and made a call, brief and specific, and he heard his neighbor Mrs. Henshaw's name. He must have mentioned her once, in passing, though he couldn't remember when. And when Ava hung up, she said, "Done. She'll be at Danica's by 11:30. Mason was quiet for a moment. Thank you. Ava sat back down. She picked up the paper coffee cup from the windowsill, cold by now, almost certainly, and turned it in her hands without drinking from it. The police came by at 2 a.m., she said. I spoke with them. They found the waiter. He was already gone by the time security reached the service corridor, but there's footage of him entering the building through a catering vendor entrance with fake credentials. She paused. The champagne glass was taken as evidence. The toxicologist thinks it was a synthetic compound, not something you'd buy commercially. Whoever prepared it knew what they were doing. Mason let that settle. Any ID on the waiter? Not yet. He used a false name on the vendor registration. He wasn't working alone. He said it without inflection because it was obvious and because softening obvious things didn't help anything. Ava looked at him steadily. No, he wasn't. He had worked for her for 2 months, and in that time he had learned her habits and her moods and the particular quality of her silences, the way you learn the mechanics of any person you spend significant time with. He had categorized her professionally, composed, intelligent, more guarded than she appeared, carrying something heavy that she had decided not to put down. He had kept her at the professional distance that the job required. Looking at her now, still in last night's dress, cup of cold coffee in her hands, having stayed through a night she did not have to stay through, he thought that he had been accurate in his assessment and that he had also missed things. My father, she said. The words came out careful and evenly weighted, the way you carry something fragile. Before he died, he was different the last few months, distracted. He started keeping files locked that he used to leave open. He had a meeting with a lawyer that he didn't tell me about, which he had never done before. Her voice didn't waver. I thought it was something personal. He was getting older, maybe making changes to his estate, private things. I didn't push. But you've been thinking about it since. I've been thinking about a lot of things since. She set the coffee cup down. He died of a heart attack. He was 61. He had a stressful job, and his cardiologist had been telling him to slow down for 2 years. There was no reason to question it. She looked out the window. I'm questioning it now. Mason said nothing. He had learned that silence, used correctly, was not empty. It was a space you offered someone, and what they chose to put in it told you something. Whoever sent that man last night, Ava said, they weren't trying to rob me. They weren't trying to send a message. They were trying to kill me. She turned from the window and looked at him with the directness that was, he had realized, her most fundamental quality. I need to know why. And I think the answer is somewhere in my father's company. You shouldn't go looking alone, Mason said. I know. She held his gaze. I'm telling you because you saved my life last night, and I think you're the only person in my current situation who I'm reasonably confident didn't try to end it. That's a small pool. It was a bleak kind of logic, but it wasn't wrong. He thought about telling her to hire a professional investigator. He thought about suggesting the police. He thought about the clean lines of his current job. Drive, protect, stay invisible. And the version of himself who had built those lines deliberately, after Ella, after everything that happened before Ella, because clean lines were what kept a 7-year-old girl safe and fed and sleeping through the night. He thought about the waiter standing near table 7. All right, he said. Ava looked at him for a moment, as if checking whether he meant it. Then she nodded once and went back to her chair, and the two of them sat in the early morning quiet of the hospital room while the city outside began its slow mechanical waking, neither of them entirely sure what they had just agreed to. Ella arrived at the hospital room at 12:15 with Mrs. Henshaw, who was 74 years old, wore orthopedic shoes, and had the energetic disapproval of someone who had raised 4 children and considered herself an authority on most human situations. She took one look at Mason in the hospital bed and said, in the tone of a verdict, I told you that job had odd hours, and then produced a Tupperware container of oatmeal cookies from her bag and set it on the bedside table. Ella was 7 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and she came through the door at the particular velocity of a child who had been told to walk slowly and had done her best to interpret slowly as liberally as possible. Dad. She stopped at the side of the bed and looked at him with the careful seriousness of a person conducting an inspection. Mrs. Henshaw said you were sick, You don't look sick. I look a little sick, Mason said. You look fine. She climbed up onto the bed beside him in the unself-conscious way of small children who have not yet learned that this is not always acceptable. Does it hurt? Not much anymore. She examined the IV line with enormous interest. What's that? Medicine. Does it go in your blood? Yes. That's gross, she said approvingly, and leaned against his shoulder. Ava had stepped back when Ella came in, pressed herself toward the far side of the room, out of the way, the instinct of someone who was uncertain about the territory she was in. Mason noticed this. Ella noticed it too, with the radar of a child accustomed to reading rooms. She looked at Ava. Who are you? Ava glanced at Mason briefly and then answered the question directly, which was, Mason thought, exactly the right approach with Ella. My name is Ava. I'm your dad's boss. Ella considered this. Are you the one who made him work at the party? I am. He wore the fancy jacket. Ella said this without evident judgment. He looked weird. He looked very professional, Ava said. There was something in her voice that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. A careful lightness, like someone testing weight on ice. Ella seemed to find this adequate. She turned back to Mason and said, Can we get breakfast? Mrs. Henshaw said she'd take me to the place with the good pancakes. The cookies are right there, Mason said. Those are for later. Pancakes are for now. She regarded him seriously. Are you going to be at home tonight? Yes. Promise? He had a rule about promising her things he wasn't certain of. She had learned at some point before he'd managed to prevent it what it felt like when promises didn't hold. He didn't make them lightly anymore. I'll be there, he said. She accepted this. The non-promise that was still a promise, calibrated to a register she could trust. She kissed him on the cheek with the decisive efficiency of someone checking an item off a list, and then slid off the bed and looked at Ava again. You can come too, she said. If you want. The pancakes are good. Ava blinked. Thank you. I have some things I need to take care of today. Ella shrugged with the philosophical ease of a child to whom rejection carries no weight. Okay. She turned to Mrs. Henshaw. Can we go now? Mrs. Henshaw gave Mason one last look of comprehensive disapproval and then herded Ella toward the door. At the threshold, without turning around, she said, Eat the cookies, Mason. You look thin. The door closed behind them. Mason became aware that he was smiling slightly. He stopped. Ava was watching him from across the room with an expression he could not categorize precisely. Something that had moved in the last 10 minutes, from careful distance to something less guarded, and was now being actively redirected back toward neutral. She's remarkable, she said. The word came out with a kind of honesty that suggested it hadn't been planned. She's a handful, Mason said. That's not a contradiction. Ava picked up her bag from the floor by the chair. The doctor will be here in an hour. I'll have someone bring you a change of clothes. And I've already called my security contractor to put additional personnel on the building where you and Ella live. She said this the way she said most logistical things, efficiently, without asking if it was wanted, having already decided it was necessary. Mason opened his mouth. I know you'll argue about it, she said. Argue later. You're in a hospital bed. He closed his mouth. She moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. The morning light from the window was behind her, and she looked tired in a way she probably wouldn't have allowed herself to look if she had been thinking about how she appeared. Mason, what you did last night, what you risked. She stopped, started again. I'm aware that I don't have the words for that. I want you to know that I'm aware of it. He thought about several different responses. Most of them were wrong. Don't mention it was dismissive. It was my job was a lie that she would see through. I'd do it again was true, but felt like too much to say out loud, in this room, with the light doing what it was doing. Get some sleep, he said instead. You've been up all night. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and left. Mason lay in the hospital bed in the quiet that she left behind, listening to the monitor beeped its steady count, and thought about the waiter near table 7 and the locked files Ava had mentioned, and a father who had died of a heart attack at 61, and the particular quality of a threat designed to look like nothing. He thought about Ella's face when she'd said promise. He thought about clean lines and the ways they could stop being enough. Through the window, the city was fully awake now, moving in its relentless and indifferent way, carrying its secrets the way it always had, in plain sight, buried in noise, waiting for someone willing to look. Mason reached for Mrs. Henshaw's oatmeal cookies. He had work to do. The discharge papers took longer than they should have, which was how most things at hospitals worked. Not through malice, just through the accumulated weight of a system processing too many people at once. Mason signed what needed to be signed, changed into the clothes Ava's assistant had brought over in a garment bag that probably cost more than Mason's monthly grocery budget, and walked out into the afternoon sun feeling like something that had been run through a machine and reassembled with most of the original parts. His throat still hurt. Not badly. A low rawness, like the aftermath of a bad cold, but enough to remind him, every time he swallowed, that yesterday had been real and not a particularly vivid stress dream. The car Ava sent was waiting at the curb. Not his car, a black SUV with a driver named Terrence, who was roughly the size of a refrigerator and communicated primarily through nods. Mason got in the back and spent the ride home with his head against the window, watching the city move past at the particular pace of a Tuesday afternoon, people going about the ordinary business of being alive in a way that felt, today, slightly more significant than usual. His apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that was clean but not new, in a neighborhood that was improving but hadn't finished yet. He had chosen it because the school district was good, and the street was quiet, and there was a park 3 blocks away where Ella could run without him having to track her every movement. It was small for 2 people. He had made it work. Mrs. Henshaw had left a note on the kitchen counter. Ella ate pancakes. She's fine. You should eat something that isn't hospital food. There's soup in the refrigerator. Don't be stupid again. The last line had been underlined twice. Mason put the soup on the stove and stood in the kitchen while it heated, not thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of thinking. He was very good at going still on the surface while everything underneath kept moving. It was a skill he'd developed early and refined over years, in circumstances that had required it. His phone rang at 3:15, Ava's name on the screen. He picked up. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Better? What did you find?" A brief pause, the kind that meant she had expected a longer answer and was recalibrating. "You should rest." "Ava." Another pause. Then, with the business-like efficiency that he had come to recognize as her version of conceding a point, "My father's assistant. His name is Roland Fitch. He's been with the company for 16 years, but he called me this morning. He said there's something I need to see. He wouldn't tell me what it was on the phone. He wants to meet tonight." "Where?" "His home office. He lives in Clearfield Heights, about 30 minutes from the city." She said the next part carefully. "He sounded frightened, Mason." Mason took the soup off the burner. "I'll drive." "You were discharged from the hospital 4 hours ago. And I'm not asking you to go alone to a frightened man's house in Clearfield Heights." He said it without inflection, which made it harder to argue with. "What time?" A pause that was different from the previous ones, less strategic, more uncertain. 7. "I'll be there at 6:30. Eastham." Roland Fitch lived in a house that had probably been aspirational when he bought it and was now simply comfortable. A 2-story colonial with a mature oak in the front yard and a porch light that came on automatically as they came up the walk. He answered the door before they knocked, which meant he had been watching for them through the front window, which told Mason something about the state of his nerves. He was in his mid-50s, slight build, with the kind of face that had spent most of its life looking careful and was now looking careful and scared, which was a different combination. He shook Ava's hand with both of his, the grip of someone who needed the contact. He looked at Mason with the brief, assessing glance of a person trying to determine whether a stranger was a threat, decided something, and stood back to let them both in. The house smelled like old books and coffee, and the faint trace of pipe tobacco that had probably been banned indoors years ago and lingered in the walls anyway. Roland led them to a study at the back of the house. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a desk buried in stacked folders, a pair of reading chairs that had been moved to create space. He did not offer them anything to drink. He sat behind the desk and looked at Ava, the way a person looks at something they've been carrying for a long time and are finally putting down. I've been trying to decide whether to do this for 4 months, he said. Since the funeral. Do what, Roland? Ava said. Her voice was patient. She had seated herself in one of the reading chairs. Mason had positioned himself standing near the door. Habit, not choice. Roland opened the top drawer of his desk and removed a manila envelope, well worn at the corners, the kind of envelope that had been handled many times. He set it on the desk but kept his hand on it. Your father came to me 8 months before he died. He was different. You know how he was, Ava? 60 years old, and he still moved like someone who had somewhere important to be. But that day, he sat down in my office and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He paused. In the silence, somewhere outside, a car passed. He told me he'd found something. In the quarterly reports, a pattern of transfers, small amounts, routed through subsidiary accounts in a sequence that was designed to look like routine operational costs. Individually, none of them would have triggered an audit flag. But he'd been going through the ledgers manually. He still did that. Even at his level, he always said the numbers told you things the summaries hid. And he'd found the pattern. Roland's hand pressed flat against the envelope. Someone had been stealing from the company for years, not aggressively, carefully. The kind of careful that knows exactly where the oversight gaps are. Ava was very still. How much? Your father estimated between 12 and 15 million over 7 years. The number landed in the room and sat there. Ava's expression did not change, but something in her jaw did. A tightening, almost imperceptible. He knew who it was? Mason asked. Roland looked at him. He had a strong suspicion. He didn't want to say the name to me. He said the less I knew directly, the safer I'd be. But he was building a case. He was documenting everything, pulling records, cross-referencing transfers. He gave me this. He pushed the envelope across the desk toward Ava and told me to keep it somewhere that wasn't the office. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you. Ava's hand moved to the envelope and stopped. Why didn't you give it to me at the funeral? Roland's face did something complicated. Because I was afraid. I know how that sounds, but your father thought the risk was serious enough to warn me explicitly, and then 3 months later he was dead, and... He stopped, swallowed. I'm sorry, Ava. I should have come to you sooner. I know that. Ava picked up the envelope. She opened it. Inside were photocopied documents, financial records, transaction logs, internal memos, pages covered in her father's handwriting, which she had not seen in 4 months and which caused something to move across her face that she controlled before it could become visible, but not quite fast enough. Mason looked away. He was not sure why. Some privacy reflex. He studied the bookshelves instead. 16 years of working for the same man left marks. Framed photos, a company anniversary plaque, a small shelf of industry publications with spines that showed real use. In one of the photos, a younger Roland stood next to a man who must have been Ava's father, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, with Ava's particular directness in the eyes. He trusted you, Mason said, still looking at the photo. He was the best man I ever worked for, Roland said, without any sentimentality about it. Just a fact. Which is why I'm doing this now, 4 months too late. Because I owe him that and I owe her that, and I've been sitting on it like a coward long enough. Ava set the documents down on the desk, carefully. When she looked up, she had reassembled everything into the face she used for difficult meetings. The attack at the gala last night, she said. Someone tried to poison me. Roland went pale. Not dramatically. Just a subtle shift, the kind of pallor that comes when a fear you've been carrying privately is suddenly confirmed out loud. I heard. I saw it on the news this morning. His voice was unsteady for the first time. That's why I called you. I should have called you months ago, but it's happening, isn't it? Whatever your father was afraid of, it's... Yes, Ava said. It is. She gathered the documents and returned them carefully to the envelope. I'm going to need copies of everything. And I need to know everything he told you. Every conversation, every detail, even things that seemed unimportant. Roland nodded. He looked, Mason thought, like a man who had just confessed something and found the weight of it less, though not gone. There's one more thing. He mentioned a name, not the person he suspected, someone else. He said if things went wrong, there was someone inside the company who could be trusted. A woman in the financial compliance department named Simone Adler. He glanced at Ava. He said she'd been quietly raising questions about the transfers internally and being ignored. He said she was either very brave or didn't understand how dangerous the situation was. Both, probably, Mason said. Roland looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of approval. Probably. They drove back through the night with the documents in Ava's lap and the city lights moving across the windshield in the steady rhythm of a highway at 60 miles an hour. Mason drove. Ava was quiet, but it was the working kind of quiet. He could almost hear the machinery of her mind processing what they had. 12 to 15 million, she said to the windshield. Over 7 years. That's not impulsive. That's a strategy. Someone who knew the company's internal structure well enough to find the oversight gaps, Mason said, and who had access to the subsidiary accounts. That narrows the field significantly. She turned the envelope over in her hands. Senior executives, board members, maybe 2 or 3 people at the operational level. She paused. My father's inner circle. Mason said nothing. She was getting there on her own, and she didn't need him to say it for her. He trusted these people, she said. The words came out flat, not grieving. She was not ready to grieve about this, he thought, and might not be for a while. Right now, she was using the anger, which was the correct move. He built the company with some of them, 30 years. She stopped. Simone Adler. We need to talk to her. Carefully, Mason said. If whoever did this knows your father was building a case, they might know about Adler too. You think she's in danger? I think anyone your father trusted with information is a potential loose end for whoever we're dealing with. Ava absorbed this. Outside, the highway gave way to city streets, and the light changed. Street lamps and storefronts, and the scattered illumination of a Tuesday night. You're very calm about this, she said. Most people haven't done the job I used to do. A pause. She had not asked about his background directly, ever. He had volunteered almost nothing. He was aware she was deciding right now whether to ask. What job was that? She said. He kept his eyes on the road. Close protection, private sector before that government adjacent. 8 years total. Why did you stop? The question was direct. He appreciated that about her. She didn't wrap things in excess qualification. My daughter needed me to be home more than she needed me to be good at that particular thing. Ava was quiet for a moment. Her mother? Not in the picture. Hasn't been for a long time. I'm sorry. Don't be. Ella's fine. He meant it. She's better than fine, actually. He stopped himself before the word remarkable could come out, which was the word Ava had used earlier and which he did not particularly want to echo. She's herself. That's enough. Ava turned to look at him, something he could feel in his peripheral vision even without looking back. You raised her alone? Since she was 2. Another silence. This one had a different quality than the professional silences they'd been exchanging for 2 months. Something more open in it, more personal, the kind that forms when people have started telling each other real things and haven't yet decided how to feel about that. My father raised me alone too, Ava said, not looking at him, back to the windshield. My mother left when I was 4. He never talked about it much, he just redirected. Every time I asked, he'd find a project or a lesson or something he wanted to show me about how the business worked. A pause. I thought I resented it for a while. When I was a teenager, I thought he was replacing emotion with information. She turned the envelope in her hands again. Now I think he was just a man who loved me and didn't know how to say it without something concrete in his hands. Mason thought about Mrs. Henshaw's oatmeal cookies. He thought about the way he had taught Ella to read financial headlines when she was 6, framing it as a game because he was better at teaching than at reassuring, and they had both known it, and she had learned both things, the headlines and the reassurance underneath. They sound similar, he said. They do, Ava said. She sounded slightly surprised, as though this had not occurred to her before saying it out loud. The Whitmore Corporation occupied the top 12 floors of a building in the financial district that Ava's father had commissioned in 1998 and which had been featured in 3 architecture magazines and 1 film that nobody remembered. Ava had an office on the 48th floor with windows that faced east, which meant that on clear mornings the light came in at an angle that made the room look like the inside of a painting. Mason had been in the lobby exactly once before to pick up a document. He had not been invited further. He was in Ava's office by 9 the next morning. She had cleared the conference table in the corner and spread the photocopied documents across it in the careful, organized pattern of someone who thought spatially. The financial records were arranged chronologically. The transaction logs were grouped by subsidiary account. Her father's handwritten notes, in the dense shorthand of a man who wrote primarily for himself, were in the center. Mason sat across from her and looked at what they had. "Walk me through it," he said. She did. Efficiently, without meandering, she had gone through the documents 3 times since they got back from Roland's house, and she had them mapped. The transfers had started 7 years ago, small and irregular, amounts that could be attributed to operational variance in any given quarter. Over time, they had grown slightly more systematic, though never so much as to suggest automation. Someone was adjusting the amounts manually, Mason thought, staying inside a threshold they had calculated carefully. "The routing is sophisticated," Ava said, tapping a page with 1 finger. "Each transfer moves through at least 3 subsidiaries before it exits the company's financial ecosystem entirely. The final destination accounts are registered in 2 different jurisdictions, one in the Channel Islands, one in Singapore. Both are shell structures." "Your father figured this out manually," Mason said, "over about 6 months, from what I can piece together from his notes." Something shifted in her voice. "He was meticulous. He left breadcrumbs for me. I think deliberately, like he knew he might not get to finish." Mason looked at the handwritten notes, dense columns of numbers with circled anomalies, arrows connecting entries across pages, the occasional word, "Why?" Cross-reference. Checkmark. The handwriting was firm and even, the hand of a man who was angry in a controlled way, which was perhaps the most dangerous kind of anger. "Simone Adler," Mason said. "What do you know about her?" Ava pulled out her phone. "I looked her up last night. She joined the compliance department 6 years ago. Her employment reviews are consistently strong. She submitted 2 internal reports in the last 3 years, flagging anomalies in subsidiary account activity. Both were reviewed and closed without action by the head of internal audit." "Who's the head of internal audit?" "A man named Peter Halloway. He's been in that role for 9 years. Ava set her phone down. "He reports to Gerald Vaughn." The name was new. Mason made a note of it. "Tell me about Vaughn." Ava stood up and moved to the window. She stood with her back to the room, which was, Mason had noticed, what she did when she was organizing thoughts she wasn't sure she wanted to say out loud. The city stretched east below her, glass and steel catching the morning sun. "Gerald Vaughn is 63 years old," she said. "He's the executive vice president of operations, effectively the second most senior person in the company after me. He and my father built the international division together in the early 90s. He was my father's best man at his second wedding, the one that didn't last." She paused. "He was at the memorial. He spoke. He said my father was the most principled man he'd ever known." She stopped. The window was doing the painting thing with the light again. "You think it's him," Mason said. Ava turned from the window. Her face had not cracked, but something around the edges of it was tight in a way that went past professional composure into something older and less manageable. "He had the access. He had the knowledge of the internal structure. He's been in a position to influence audit outcomes for years." She stopped again. "And he is the only person senior enough to have been informed about the gala's guest arrangements in advance. He knew I'd be there. He knew which events I'd be attending this month." "We don't have proof yet," Mason said carefully. "I know that." Her voice was sharp, not at him, but with the sharpness of someone working to keep something contained. "I know that. That's why we need Simone Adler." She sat back down at the conference table. "And I know that talking to her carries risk. If she's been flagging the anomalies internally and her reports have been suppressed, she may already be watched. We need to approach her carefully." "Not at the office," Mason said. No, not by phone. Agreed. You have her home address? Ava gave him a look. I have access to HR records, yes. Then we do this in person, unannounced, somewhere she controls. And we don't tell anyone in this building that we're doing it. Ava held his gaze for a moment. You're good at this, she said. It came out less like a compliment and more like an observation, the kind you make when you're updating a previous assessment. I used to be, he said. You still are. She said it simply, without decoration, and reached for the financial records again. Simone Adler lived in a third-floor walk-up in the Grayfield district, 20 minutes from downtown, in a building that was exactly what it looked like, solid and unglamorous. The building equivalent of someone who has decided to stop caring what things look like and start caring whether they function. There were pot plants on the stairwell landings that suggested at least one tenant with persistent optimism. The mailboxes were labeled in different people's handwriting. Ava knocked. Mason stood slightly back and to the side, which was a habit he had stopped apologizing for. 30 seconds. Then the sound of movement and a voice on the other side of the door. Who is it? My name is Ava Whitmore, Ava said. I think you knew my father. I think he trusted you. And I think you've been trying to do the right thing for a while and nobody's been listening. Silence. Then the door opened. Simone Adler was in her late 30s, with short natural hair and the kind of steady evaluating gaze that Mason associated with people who have learned to make quick decisions about whether to trust what's in front of them. She was in weekend clothes, Saturday morning clothes, and she looked at Ava the way people look at something they've been waiting for without quite believing it would come. I wondered, she said, if you'd ever come. She stood back and let them in. Her apartment was small and ordered, the walls covered in a combination of artwork and, Mason noted, a pinboard near the desk in the corner that was covered in printed documents and color-coded notes, the kind of thing you built when you were working a problem too big for any individual piece of paper. Simone poured coffee without asking if they wanted it, which was the right call. She sat across from them at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at Ava directly. Your father called me once, she said, about 5 months before he died. He asked me a series of very specific questions about subsidiary account reporting procedures and how anomalies would typically get escalated. He didn't explain why. He called from a private number. She paused. I told him the truth, which is that I had been filing reports and watching them disappear. Suppressed by Holloway, Ava said. Simone blinked, the brief, genuine blink of surprise. You've been doing your homework. My father did the homework, Ava said quietly. I'm finishing it. Simone looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and stood up and went to the pinboard. She unpinned a thick folder and brought it back to the table. I've been keeping my own copies. Everything I submitted internally, plus the original transaction data I flagged, plus my analysis of the routing structure. She set it on the table. I was going to go to a financial regulator eventually, but I was scared and I kept thinking someone inside the company would do it first, and they didn't. You're not wrong to have been scared, Mason said. He said it without drama, which made it land more solidly than if he'd tried to soften it. Someone tried to kill Ava 4 days ago. Simone's hands went still on her mug. I heard about the gala. I didn't know. It was targeted, Ava said. Whoever we're dealing with is serious, which means you may also be at risk, given the reports you filed and what you know. The color in Simone's face shifted. Not panic. She was too composed for outright panic, but a recalibration, the look of someone who had known intellectually that a thing was dangerous and is now understanding it in a different, more physical way. What do I do? Right now? Don't go into the office until we tell you it's clear, Mason said. If anything unusual happens, if anyone approaches you, if you feel like you're being watched, you call this number. He wrote his personal cell on a piece of paper and pushed it across. Not the police, not anyone from the company. This number. Simone took the paper, looked at it, looked at him. Who are you exactly? Her driver, Mason said. Simone looked at Ava. He's more than that, Ava said. The simplicity of it, no qualification, no elaboration, was the most direct thing she had said about him to anyone, And Mason found, to his mild surprise, that this registered in a way he hadn't anticipated. He did not say anything. He picked up his coffee. Simone said, "There's one more thing. In the most recent batch of transactions I flagged, the ones from 8 months ago, there's a payment that's different from the others. It's larger, significantly larger, and it's not routed through the subsidiary chain. It goes directly to an account I can't trace." She opened the folder and pointed to a line item. $380,000. Single transaction. The timing? She looked up, and her voice was careful and level and carried the weight of what she was about to say, is consistent with the week before your father died. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere on the street below, a car horn sounded, brief and ordinary. The noise of a city that did not know or care what was being said in a third-floor apartment in the Grayfield district on a Wednesday morning. Ava looked at the document. Mason looked at Ava. She did not cry. He had not expected her to. Not here, not now. But he watched something travel across her face, something without a clean name, the kind of thing that happens when a fear you have been carrying in the vague, formless space of maybe suddenly becomes specific and documented and real. She looked up at Simone. Her voice was absolutely steady. "Can you give me a copy of that?" "I'll give you everything," Simone said. They left 40 minutes later with 2 folders, a USB drive, and the particular kind of heavy silence that follows a confirmation nobody wanted. On the sidewalk below Simone's building, Ava stood for a moment in the pale November light, not moving, her eyes on the middle distance. Mason stood beside her and did not rush her. "He was murdered," she said finally. Not a question, not a breakdown. A statement of fact delivered in the voice of someone who has decided that facts are what they have to work with, and they will work with them. "The evidence is building that way," Mason said. "Gerald Vaughn." She said the name like she was picking it up and weighing it, deciding what to do with it. "He was at the memorial. He shook my hand and said my father would have wanted me to be strong." Mason didn't say anything. Some things don't need a response, and some responses would be wrong. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were dry and very clear. "I'm going to take him apart," she said. "Every financial record, every transaction, everything my father documented, everything Simone collected. I'm going to build something so complete that there is no room left to maneuver." "That's the right approach," Mason said. "Careful, thorough, nothing that can be challenged. I know how to build a case." There was something in her voice, not exactly pride, but something adjacent to it, a competence taking hold. "My father taught me. He used to make me audit mock financial statements for fun when I was 12. For a moment, something lighter moved across her face. Not a smile, but the shadow of one, there and gone. "I hated it. He thought it was the best game he'd ever invented." "He wasn't wrong," Mason said. She looked at him with the fractional surprise of someone caught off guard by a small kindness they hadn't expected. Then she turned toward the car. "Come on," she said. "We have work to do." He followed her. The November sun was doing its thin, honest best with the available sky, and the street was loud with the ordinary sounds of people going about ordinary things. And somewhere across the city, Ella was in school, learning multiplication tables, or drawing horses, or practicing the particular brand of social navigation that 7-year-olds conduct with the seriousness of diplomats. Mason thought about the $380,000 transfer. He thought about the timing. He thought about a man who had died of a heart attack at 61, and a daughter who had stood at his memorial and shaken the hand of the man who'd had him killed. He thought about what was coming, and what it would cost, and whether the 2 folders on the back seat of the car were the beginning of the end or just the beginning of the middle. He started the engine. Either way, there was only one direction to go. The evidence took 11 days to build into something that could hold weight. 11 days of early mornings and late nights in Ava's office, the conference table buried under organized layers of financial records, transaction printouts, and the handwritten notes her father had left behind, like a map to a place he never got to reach. Mason had brought in a second laptop. Ava's assistant, a young woman named Claire, who asked no questions and seemed to operate on the principle that her job was to make things happen rather than understand why, kept them supplied with coffee, and made certain no one from the senior executive floor came by without advance notice. Simone Adler worked remotely, sending encrypted files through a channel Mason had set up. Not paranoia, just sense. He had seen enough situations go wrong at the point where someone assumed the secure option was good enough and chose convenience instead. The picture that assembled itself across those 11 days was not surprising, exactly. They had known the broad shape of it since Roland Fitch's study. But the specificity of it was something else. Numbers had a way of making things real that narrative alone couldn't achieve. $15.3 million moved across 7 years through a chain of subsidiary accounts so carefully designed that it had taken Ava's father 6 months of manual ledger review to find it. 38 separate transactions, 11 different intermediary accounts, 2 final destination structures in jurisdictions chosen specifically for their limited cooperation with international financial investigators, and 1 payment that stood apart from the rest, $380,000. Direct transfer, no subsidiary routing, time to the week before Richard Whitmore's death. Mason had spent 2 days on that payment alone. The destination account was a shell, but shells had seams if you knew where to apply pressure, and he had spent 8 years in a profession where knowing how money moved and who it moved for was a survival skill. He called in a favor from a former colleague, a woman named Dana Priest, who now worked in financial intelligence for a private firm in Washington, and who owed him a professional debt he had been saving for something that mattered. She called back in 36 hours. The account traces to a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, she said. The holding company's beneficial owner is listed as a trust, which is common enough, but the trust has a corporate trustee that I can trace through 2 more layers to a law firm in the Channel Islands that has, in the last 4 years, handled financial arrangements for at least 6 individuals connected to organized private security contracting. Mason had sat with that for a moment. You're saying the payment went to someone who arranges professional violence. I'm saying the payment went somewhere that has historically been associated with that kind of arrangement. I can't prove a direct line, but the structure is consistent. A pause. Mason, what is this? Something I'm trying to finish before it finishes someone else, he said. Dana was quiet for a moment. Be careful. Always. He was not always careful, but he was careful about the things that mattered. When he brought this to Ava, she received it sitting behind her desk with the stillness of someone absorbing a blow they had prepared for, but that lands differently than the preparation suggested. She read his summary twice. Then she set it down and looked at the window for a long time. He paid someone to kill my father, she said. The evidence is strongly suggestive of that, Mason said. It's not a confession, but combined with everything else, it's enough. Her voice was flat and certain. It's enough for me. It needs to be enough for a prosecutor, he said carefully, which means we can't move on it until we have the full picture documented and in the hands of someone we trust. She looked at him. Are you telling me to be patient? I'm telling you that going directly at Vaughn right now without the right preparation gives him time to move money, destroy records, and build a story. He's been doing this for 7 years without being caught. He's not careless. Mason held her gaze. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. She held his gaze for a long measuring moment. Then she exhaled, slowly, the breath of someone releasing something they wanted to act on before they were ready. Fine. How do we do it right? He had been thinking about that for 2 days. We need him to say it himself. The plan had a simplicity to it that Mason liked, because simple plans had fewer points of failure. Ava would contact Gerald Vaughn directly. She would tell him that she had been reviewing her father's private financial records and had found irregularities she wanted to discuss with him privately, as a trusted member of her father's inner circle, as someone she turned to for guidance. She would frame it as confusion rather than accusation. She would suggest she was open to a quiet resolution. She would let him hear, underneath the words, the thing that powerful men who have been operating without consequence for years most wanted to hear, that the person who could expose them was uncertain and looking for a way out of the situation rather than a way through it. And when he believed that, when he relaxed into the confidence of someone who had already won, she would let him talk. Mason would be close enough to intervene if the situation changed. The recording would be running the entire time. Ava heard it all and then said, You think he'll admit to it? I think men who have gotten away with something for 7 years and who believe they're still getting away with it have a habit of explaining themselves, Mason said, especially to someone they consider manageable. You're 30 years old and you just inherited a company you don't have your father's history with. To Vaughn, that's an opportunity, not a threat. Something moved across Ava's face, a cold precision settling into place. He underestimates me. That's the whole plan, Mason said. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes wore when he had said something that landed exactly where she needed it. Not gratitude exactly. Something more like recognition. All right, she said. Set it up. She called Vaughn from her office the next morning, with Mason sitting across from her in the recorder. A clean device, nothing networked, nothing that could be remotely accessed, running on the desk. Vaughn picked up on the second ring. His voice, when she introduced the topic, shifted in a way that Mason caught and Ava caught, a fractional tightening, the practiced smoothness of a man recalibrating in real time. But he agreed to meet. Of course he agreed to meet. A confused young CEO who had found some irregular records and wanted a trusted senior advisor's guidance was precisely the kind of situation he would want to control in person. They set it for 2 days later. A Thursday evening, after hours, at a private dining club near the financial district that Vaughn used for sensitive conversations. His suggestion, which told Mason something. He was most comfortable on ground he controlled. That was fine. Control was an illusion anyway, and it was a more dangerous one when you believed in it too completely. The 2 days between were the longest kind. Mason drove Ella to school in the mornings and found himself sitting in the school drop-off line thinking about contingency plans and exit routes, running scenarios with the part of his brain that had never entirely stopped doing that, even in the years when he'd tried hardest to redirect it. Ella, in the back seat, provided a running commentary on the social dynamics of second grade that required enough of his attention to keep him mostly in the present. Danica says Marcus took her eraser on purpose, but I think he just picked it up by accident, Ella said on Thursday morning, the day of the meeting. But Danica is really sure. What do you think you should do? Mason said. I told her maybe ask him, but she says if she asks him and he says it was an accident, then she still doesn't get an apology. She wants the apology more than the eraser. Ella considered this with the seriousness of a small philosopher. Yeah, I think so. A pause. Is that wrong? No, Mason said. Most things people argue about aren't really about the surface thing. The surface thing, Ella repeated, tasting the phrase. You mean the eraser? I mean the eraser. She was quiet for a moment. Dad, are you okay? He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was watching him with the particular attention she deployed sometimes, inherited from nobody he could identify, a quality that was entirely hers, that saw more than 7-year-olds were supposed to see. I'm fine, he said. You've been quiet for like 3 days. I have a lot on my mind. Is it the work thing? What work thing? I don't know. You have a work thing. You always look like that when you have a work thing. She adjusted her backpack straps. Mom used to say you carried stuff in your shoulders. He had not expected that. He was quiet for a moment, hands on the wheel. She said that? Yeah. Ella said it simply, without weight. She had only the vaguest memories of her mother, and she had learned to handle them the way you handle something that doesn't fit neatly anywhere, carefully, without forcing it. I don't remember who told me. Maybe it was Grandma. She looked out the window. Your shoulders do look like that, though. He dropped her at school and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes afterward, which he did not ordinarily do. Then he drove to Ava's building. The private dining club was called Alderton's, which was the kind of name that communicated exactly what it wanted to. Old money, discretion, the sort of establishment that had been hosting conversations it was better not to have in public since sometime in the 1950s. Dark wood paneling, tables spaced far enough apart that privacy was architectural, not just social. A staff trained to be present only when needed. Mason had walked the space that afternoon under the pretext of confirming a reservation. He had identified the entrance points, the sight lines, the location of the room Vaughn had booked for the evening. A private dining room off the main floor. 6 seats, 1 door, a window that opened onto an interior courtyard 3 floors below. The window was not a viable exit. The door was the only way in and out. He had also spent 40 minutes on Gerald Vaughn's background, not the professional biography. He had that from Ava, but the other kind. Vaughn had a home in the Whitfield suburb, a second property in coastal Maine, a daughter at a private university in Boston. He drove a car registered in his wife's name, which was either tax strategy or old habit. He had 2 speeding violations in the last decade, both dismissed. He had never held a firearms license. This last detail was relevant. At 6:45 p.m., Ava stood outside Alderton's in a dark suit that cost what Mason used to make in a month, her hair back, her face carrying the precise expression they had discussed, worried, uncertain, slightly overwhelmed, vulnerable enough to invite confidence, composed enough to be credible. "Last chance to go over it," Mason said. "I know what to do." She said it without dismissiveness, a statement of fact, the reassurance of someone who had rehearsed enough to stop needing rehearsal. "The recorder is on. If he says anything that escalates the situation physically, I know. If it goes sideways at any point, you find a reason to go to the bathroom and you text me the word clear, and I come in." "I know, Mason." She looked at him. In the evening light outside the restaurant, with the city doing its Thursday night things around them, she looked less like the Ava Whitmore he had driven to events for 2 months, and more like a person who was about to do something hard and had decided to do it anyway. "How do I look?" He studied her. "Exactly right," he said. "He'll see someone he can manage." Something flickered in her eyes. "Good." She straightened, almost imperceptibly. "Don't go far." "I'll be at the bar." She went in. He watched the door close behind her, and then he waited 30 seconds and followed. The bar at Alderton's was a dark, quiet affair, with a bartender who moved with the economy of someone who had been doing the job for 20 years and saw no reason to perform it. Mason took a stool with a sightline to the hallway that led to the private dining rooms and ordered a club soda with lime. The bartender did not comment on the non-alcoholic choice. Mason appreciated this. He sat. He waited. He was good at waiting. At 7:03, Gerald Vaughn walked through the front entrance. Mason had seen photographs, but photographs were compressed. They flattened the quality of presence, which was the thing that told you the most about a person. Vaughn was tall, well-built for his age, with the kind of silver hair that men in his position cultivated as an asset. He moved with the particular confidence of someone who had been important for long enough that importance had become structural, not performed, just embedded. His suit fit perfectly. His face was arranged in an expression of warm senior concern. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had learned to weaponize trustworthiness. Mason watched him greet the maitre d', exchange the brief pleasantries of a regular, and walk down the hall toward the private room. His stride was even. His shoulders were relaxed. He was not nervous. That would change. Mason turned back to his club soda and resettled into the practiced patience of someone who had once waited 12 hours in a vehicle for a situation to resolve itself, and who understood that time, used correctly, was a resource rather than a burden. Around him, the bar murmured with Thursday evening conversation. Business dinners in the late stages, a couple in the early stages of something. A man alone with a scotch and a phone he kept checking. The minutes moved. At 7:31, Mason's phone vibrated. Not a text. A notification from the audio monitoring app he had configured to alert him to volume spikes in the recording environment. He put in one earbud, keeping the other out, and listened. Vaughn's voice, through the tiny recorder in Ava's jacket pocket, was clear enough. "Understand why you're troubled, Ava. Your father kept a great deal to himself in his final months. I think, if I'm honest, some of what he was doing was driven by stress. He was under enormous pressure, the kind that can distort—" "I'm not talking about stress," Ava said. Her voice was exactly right. Slightly hesitant, slightly firmer than she'd let herself sound in the opening. The voice of someone who had come in uncertain and was finding a thread. "I'm talking about specific transactions, Gerald. 13 separate transfers over 6 years that route through subsidiary accounts and exit the company entirely. My father documented them. He left documentation." A silence. When Vaughn spoke again, the warmth in his voice had recalibrated. Still present, but engineered differently. The warmth of management, not mentorship. "Ava, honey, Financial structures at this level are enormously complex. What looks like an irregularity to someone without the full operational context. Don't, Ava said, quietly, clearly. Another silence. I have the full transaction record, she said. I have my father's analysis. I have the destination account structures. And I have the compliance reports that were flagged internally and suppressed. She stopped. I'm not confused, Gerald. I came here because I thought... She let the pause do its work. I thought maybe there was a reason. Something I didn't understand. Something my father didn't tell me. Maybe an arrangement that made sense from a business perspective that I haven't been briefed on. Her voice shifted just slightly. The offer underneath the words, the opening she was leaving him. I'm not looking to destroy the company. I'm looking to understand what was happening. Mason listened to Vaughn breathe for approximately 3 seconds. Then, what do you want? It was the turn. The moment when a man who had been managing a situation decided that managing it had a cost he could calculate and pay. Mason had seen it before, in different contexts. The precise instant when someone stopped defending and started negotiating. I want the truth, Ava said. That's all. The truth, Vaughn said, and there was something in the word now. A bitterness, a contempt, the way a person says something when they have spent long enough using it as a tool that they no longer believe in its meaning. The truth is that your father built something worth $3 billion and spent 30 years being principled about it, while the world around him changed. The truth is that the operational costs he refused to acknowledge, the relationships that required maintenance, the arrangements that kept certain regulatory processes moving in the right direction, those costs had to come from somewhere. You're describing bribery, Ava said. I'm describing business, Vaughn said. The kind your father was too proud to do himself, so someone else had to do it for him. Someone else, Ava said. You. I kept that company viable for 20 years in markets your father didn't want to understand. 15 million over 7 years to maintain the relationships and the arrangements that made his moral clarity affordable. His voice had taken on the quality of someone who had rehearsed this justification in private until it felt righteous. He found out. He didn't want to understand context. He just... The word came out with a flatness that said everything, decided to be Richard Whitmore about it. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside in the bar, Mason had gone very still. He was going to expose me, Vaughn said. Turn me over to regulators, people he'd built relationships with over 3 decades. Destroy everything, including himself, including the company, because he'd rather be right than be practical. A pause. I couldn't allow that. You couldn't allow it, Ava said. Her voice was absolutely even. So you arranged for him to die. The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. Mason counted. I arranged for a medical situation to occur, Vaughn said, in a man who his own cardiologist had told repeatedly that his heart was under strain. I accelerated something that was going to happen anyway. He said it the way people say things they have told themselves so many times that the words have stopped feeling like confessions and started feeling like explanations. It wasn't murder, Ava said. It was murder. Vaughn heard something in her voice. Maybe the certainty. Maybe the steadiness where he had expected grief or hesitation. Maybe the absence of the vulnerability he had walked into this room believing in. His next words came out differently. Flatter, more alert. Ava, and you sent someone to poison me at the Hargrove Grand, she said, because I was getting too close. Ava, a different tone now, calculating. Whatever you think you have, I have you saying it in your own words. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a man understanding in real time that the ground has shifted. Mason was already moving off the bar stool. He heard Vaughn's chair scrape back through the earbud, heard the shift in ambient sound that meant someone was standing, and then Ava's voice, controlled, but with an edge that told him she was reading the room. Gerald? He covered the hallway in 8 steps and went through the door of the private dining room without knocking. The room was small. Vaughn was on his feet, on the far side of the table. He had moved to the window side, which was a dead end, which meant he had not thought it through. His face had undergone a transformation that stripped away 20 years of polished professional presentation and revealed something older and harder underneath. His hand was reaching into his jacket. "Don't," Mason said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the quality of someone for whom the word stop was not a social convention, but a technical instruction. Vaughn's hand stopped. Ava was standing by the door, pressed slightly to one side. She had moved when Vaughn stood, which was correct instinct. Her face was steady. The recorder was still running in her pocket. He could see it in the slight set of her jaw, the deliberate control of her breathing. "Take your hand out of your jacket," Mason said. Slowly. "Show me what's in it." Vaughn looked at him, then at Ava, then back at Mason. He was processing. Mason could see it. The rapid internal calculation of a man who had spent 7 years being the person who arranged things and was now in a room where someone else had arranged them better. The hand came out. It was holding a phone. Mason exhaled once, internally, not visibly. "Give it to me," he said. Vaughn held it for a moment, a last, pointless resistance, and then set it on the table. Mason picked it up without moving closer than necessary. Locked screen. He pocketed it. "Sit down," Mason said. Vaughn didn't sit. He stood with the rigid posture of a man in the final stages of realizing that every exit has closed, still running the numbers on a situation that no longer had a favorable outcome column. "You don't have anything that will—" "Mr. Vaughn." Mason's voice was level and clean. "You just confessed to embezzlement, to arranging a murder, and to conspiracy to commit a second murder, in a room with a running recording device. Your financial transactions are documented in enough detail that the paper trail alone will take prosecutors approximately 2 years to fully prosecute, which means you will not see the outside of a courtroom for a very long time." He paused. "Sit down." Vaughn sat. He sat the way people sit when the structure they have built their identity around has just been removed, heavily, with the particular deflation of someone whose confidence was never really theirs to begin with, because it had always been borrowed from a position rather than built from something real. Ava took her phone from her pocket and made a call. She had already spoken with a former federal prosecutor she knew through her father, a woman named Hargrove who had built a career on financial crimes, and who had, when Ava had approached her 3 days ago, listened to a summary of the evidence and said she would be available on short notice. She was available now. Mason stood near the door while Ava spoke on the phone. He did not look at Vaughn. He looked at the room. The dark wood paneling, the white tablecloth, the untouched dinner that Alderton's staff had set before the meeting began, a bottle of red wine that nobody had opened. He thought about Richard Whitmore, doing manual ledger reviews in a company he had built over 30 years, finding something he hadn't been looking for, deciding what to do about it. He thought about the kind of man it took to decide that principle was worth the cost. He thought it was a shame they hadn't met. Ava ended the call. She stood in the center of the room with the recorder in her hand now. She had taken it out, no point in concealing it anymore, and she looked at Gerald Vaughn with an expression that was not triumph, and was not grief, and was not anger exactly, though it contained traces of all three. It was something colder and more specific than any of those things. "He trusted you," she said. The same thing Roland Fitch had said, in his study, looking at a photograph. But from Ava, it landed differently. 30 years. "He trusted you." Vaughn looked at the tablecloth. He did not answer. "I don't need you to explain it," she said. "I have the recording. I have the evidence. I have everything." She stopped. "I just wanted you to know that I know." Outside the private dining room, the muffled sound of Alderton's Thursday evening continued its ordinary business. Cutlery, low voices, the soft machinery of a restaurant doing what restaurants do. Unremarkable and indifferent, the way the world tends to be while consequential things happen inside it. Mason opened the door and stepped into the hallway to wait for the people who were coming. Behind him, in the room, Ava stood in the silence and held the recorder and did not look away from the man who had taken her father from her. She had 3 months of grief that she had not yet allowed herself to fully feel. She knew this. She had set it aside deliberately because grief and investigation are incompatible processes, and she had chosen investigation. But the grief was there. It had been there the whole time, patient and specific, waiting for the room she would eventually have to give it. That room was coming. For now, she stood in the private dining room at Alderton's with a recording that was going to dismantle 7 years of carefully constructed crime, and she held herself exactly as her father had taught her, upright, composed, with everything she was feeling carried in the shoulders in a way that anyone who knew how to look could see clearly. Mason, from the hallway, could see it. He said nothing. Some things you witness without trying to fix them. He heard the sound of cars pulling up outside. He checked his watch. He thought about Ella, asleep by now. She had a curfew of 8:30 and took it seriously in the way she took most rules seriously, which was to say she negotiated the edges vigorously and then complied. He thought about Mrs. Henshaw's standing offer to stay late when he needed it, delivered in the manner of someone who would deny making any such offer if it were described as kindness. He heard Ava's footsteps behind him, measured and deliberate, coming out of the room. She came to stand beside him in the hallway. She looked at the front entrance where 2 men in dark coats were coming through the door with the economical movement of people who had been called to do a specific thing and were here to do it. "It's done," she said. "Almost," Mason said. "Almost done." She looked at him. Something in her face had shifted. The particular exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from the end of sustained effort. The moment when you have been holding something for a long time, and the holding is finally, nearly, over. "Thank you," she said. And she said it the way people say things when they mean them completely, and have no interest in dressing them up. Mason nodded once. The men in dark coats reached the hallway. The rest of the night began its work. The arrest happened quietly, which surprised people who had been expecting something more dramatic. Gerald Vaughn was taken into custody at 9:14 p.m. on a Thursday, walked out of Alderton's through the service entrance at the specific request of the federal prosecutor's team, who had correctly identified that a spectacle at the front entrance of one of the city's most visible private dining clubs would generate the kind of press that complicated the early stages of a prosecution. He went without resistance. Mason watched him from the hallway and thought that this was, in some ways, the truest thing he had seen about the man all evening. That when the performance was no longer possible, there was very little underneath. The men who took him were efficient and spoke to Vaughn in the even procedural tones of people for whom this was a process rather than a moment. Vaughn's hands, when they cuffed them, were steady. His face had settled into a blankness that was either shock or the mask a person reaches for when all the other masks have stopped working. He did not look at Ava when they walked him past her. She did not step aside to give him more room than the hallway required. The female prosecutor, whose name was Christine Hargrove, and who had the focused intensity of someone who had spent 30 years turning financial crimes into viable federal cases, arrived 15 minutes after the arrest. She was in her mid-60s, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and looked at the recording device Ava handed her with the expression of someone receiving exactly the piece they had been missing. "Full confession," Ava said. "Embezzlement, admitted. Murder of my father, admitted. Conspiracy to commit a second murder, admitted. All on the recording." Hargrove listened to 45 seconds of it on the spot, standing in the hallway of Alderton's with one hand pressed to her other ear to block the ambient noise. Then she looked up and said, to no one in particular, "Well, that makes several things considerably easier." She took the recording, the compiled financial documents, Simone Adler's folder, Roland Fitch's materials, and the analysis of the $380,000 transfer and informed Ava, in the direct language of someone who had no interest in managing expectations she couldn't support, that the next several months were going to be complicated, extensive, and would require Ava's full cooperation at multiple stages. She said this without apology because it was true. Ava said she understood. She meant it. Mason drove her home that night in a silence that was different from the professional silences of 2 months ago. Fuller, somehow. More occupied. He kept his eyes on the road and let her have the quiet she needed, because what she needed and what she wanted were, for the first time in a while, probably the same thing. At her building, she got out and then paused with the car door open, which she did not usually do. She usually moved with the decisive efficiency of someone who had already decided what came next before the current thing was finished. The pause was small, but it was real. "My father had a study at the house in Whitfield," she said. "He spent most of his serious thinking time there. After he died, I couldn't go in. I've had it locked since the funeral. She was looking at the entrance to her building, not at Mason. I think I need to go there, soon. That sounds right, Mason said. She looked at him then. Would you come? He had not expected the question, and he did not answer it immediately, which was its own kind of answer. She saw this and said, You don't have to. I think it would be easier if someone else was there. Someone who... She stopped, reorganized. Someone I trust. The word sat in the car for a moment. He had worked for her for 2.5 months. He had been poisoned in a hospital while she sat in a chair through the night. They had spent 11 days building an evidence case side by side. She had walked into a private dining room and faced the man who had killed her father on her own, with Mason a hallway away, which was exactly close enough and exactly far enough. He had seen her manage fear and grief and fury with the same composed efficiency she brought to everything, and he had also seen, in the gaps between the composure, the person underneath, real and imperfect and carrying significantly more than she let show. Trust was not a small word. She was not a person who used it lightly. Yes, he said. I'll come. She nodded. She closed the car door and went inside. He sat for a moment in the empty street and then pulled away from the curb and drove home through the quiet city, thinking about the way the word trust had sounded in the enclosed space of the car, how it had not been accompanied by any of the usual softening language, how she had just said it straight, the way she said most things. The days that followed had the quality of aftermath, the particular atmosphere that settles over a situation once the acute thing is over and the sustained thing begins. It was not calm, exactly, but it was different. The urgency that had structured the last 3 weeks gave way to the slower, more demanding work of consequence and process. The federal investigation moved on its own timeline, which was the government's timeline, methodical and impersonal, designed for thoroughness rather than speed. Christine Hargrove's team spent the first week establishing the chain of custody for every piece of evidence and conducting their own independent verification of the financial documentation. They interviewed Roland Fitch. They interviewed Simone Adler, who had spent the 48 hours since their last meeting making additional copies of everything she owned and hiding them in 3 separate locations, which Hargrove's investigators found both endearing and professionally sound. They found Peter Halloway, the internal audit director who had suppressed Simone's reports. He hired a lawyer within 4 hours of being contacted and began cooperating within 48, which was the standard trajectory of a man who understood that his role had been significant enough to be prosecuted, but secondary enough that cooperation was his best available option. His testimony corroborated the timeline. It filled in gaps that the financial records alone could only suggest. The Channel Islands shell structure was pierced through an international legal assistance request that Hargrove filed on the first day, and that moved faster than such requests usually did, partly because the structure had appeared in 2 other investigations that the relevant authorities were happy to close. The Cayman Islands holding company took another week, but it resolved in the same direction. The $380,000 transfer connected, through 3 documented steps, to a private security contractor who had no criminal record and, when located in a city 400 miles away, declined to say anything at all. This was expected. What was less expected was that a search of his financial records produced a secondary connection, a subpayment, smaller, routed to a pharmaceutical contact, that Hargrove's team identified as the likely source of the compound that had been in Ava's champagne glass and that had ended up briefly in Mason's body instead. The compound was a synthetic cardiac agent. Administered in sufficient quantity, it would induce what presented clinically as a sudden cardiac event in a person whose cardiovascular history suggested susceptibility. In a 61-year-old man whose cardiologist had been concerned about his heart for 2 years, it would look like exactly what Vaughn had described, an acceleration of something that was going to happen anyway. Mason read the toxicology summary that Hargrove shared with Ava and sat with it for a few minutes before saying anything. "Same method," he said. "Yes," Ava said. She was behind her desk, in the office that still had her father's photograph on the shelf. She had not moved it, and he had not asked why. "Consistent compound, different dosage. My father received a larger amount, administered separately." She stopped. "They think it was in something he consumed the evening before his death. A drink, possibly. something he would not have questioned accepting from someone he trusted. Mason said nothing for a moment. The radiators in the office made a low sound, which they often did in the mid-morning, the building's heating system conducting its daily argument with itself. "The waiter at the gala," he said. "Was he connected to the contractor?" "Still working on it. Hargrove's team has the catering company's false registration records. The man hasn't been found yet." She said this without evident frustration. She had learned, in the past 10 days, the particular patience of handing a thing to a process you could not control the speed of. "They'll find him eventually." "They will," Mason said. He believed this. He had enough experience with the kind of investigation that had access to financial intelligence and multiple cooperating witnesses to know that it was very rare for something this documented to develop unresolvable loose ends. Ava stood up and moved to the window, the east window, with the morning light. She stood there for a moment in a silence that was not the working kind. Then she said, "I want to go to the house in Whitfield this weekend, Saturday, if that works for you." "It works," Mason said. She turned from the window. "I spoke with Ella's teacher. She called to let me know that Ella did a creative writing assignment this week about—" She stopped, and something happened in her expression that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood, about a driver who saved a princess from a poisoned cup. Mason closed his eyes briefly. "Please tell me she didn't submit that." "She did submit it. She got an A. Mrs. I forget the teacher's name. She said it was very imaginative." "It's not imaginative," Mason said. "It's a transcript." "Roughly." Ava looked at him steadily. "She titled it, 'My Dad is Actually a Hero,' past tense, actually. She used it as an intensifier." Mason looked at the window, at the radiators, at the middle distance. "She's going to be insufferable about this." "She already is, I imagine," Ava said. And this time the something in her expression completed itself into an actual smile, brief and genuine, the kind that arrived without being invited and left before it could be examined. It was the first real one he had seen from her in 2 weeks. He found, unexpectedly, that it made the morning feel lighter. The house in Whitfield was 40 minutes from the city on a clear day, situated on a property that was generous without being ostentatious. The aesthetic decision of a man who had been wealthy for long enough that he had stopped needing to display it. A stone driveway, old trees, a garden that had been tended through the summer and was now in its November state, dormant and spare, showing the bones of what it was rather than the decoration. Mrs. Henshaw had, without being asked, suggested that Ella spend Saturday at her apartment, because Ella had a standing invitation and because Mrs. Henshaw possessed an intuitive understanding of when adults needed to do something without a 7-year-old's running commentary, and she exercised this understanding with the discretion of someone who had seen enough of life to know which doors to leave open and which to let close quietly. Mason drove. Ava sat with her hands in her lap and watched the city give way to suburbs, and then to the particular landscape of late November. Bare branches, pale sky, the occasional persistence of something still green. She had been quiet since they left, but it was a different quiet than the professional ones, more personal. He did not try to fill it. The house had a caretaker who had been managing it since the funeral, a man named Garrett, who met them at the front door with the brief courtesy of someone who understood that this was not his moment and handed Ava the keys without ceremony. She thanked him, and he left. The house smelled like it had been closed up, that particular amalgamation of stale air and old wood, and the faint ghost of someone's habits. Coffee, maybe. The specific brand her father had favored. She stood in the entrance hall and breathed it in and did not move for a long moment. Mason stayed near the door. "It's the same," she said. Not to him exactly. To the house, maybe. To herself. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something to feel different." She moved down the hall, past framed photographs he didn't look at because they were hers to look at. He followed at a distance that gave her the space to be in the house without him crowding it. The study was at the back, overlooking the garden. She used the key Garrett had given her on the lock she had put on herself 4 months ago, the day after the funeral, when she hadn't been ready, and opened the door. The room was exactly what Mason would have expected from the other evidence of the man, organized, purposeful, with the comfortable disorder of genuine use rather than the curated clutter of display. Books that had been pulled and replaced and pulled again. a desk that had papers still on it, the papers of a man who had expected to return. A photograph on the wall of a much younger Richard Whitmore shaking hands with someone at what looked like a groundbreaking, grinning with the unselfconscious pleasure of someone who had not yet learned to manage his expressions for the camera. On the desk, between a stapler and a coffee mug holding pens, was a framed photograph of Ava at approximately 13, in the middle of what appeared to be a very serious chess game, frowning at the board with the concentration of someone who intended to win. She saw it and went still. Mason looked away from the desk. He looked at the bookshelves, floor to ceiling on the east wall, organized by what appeared to be subject rather than alphabetical order. Business and economics on the upper shelves, history across the middle, a bottom shelf of novels, spines cracked with use, the reading of someone who didn't do it for appearances. Behind him, he heard Ava sit down, not at the desk, in the reading chair by the window, the one that faced the garden. He turned. She was sitting with her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, not crying. He could tell by the set of her shoulders, the stillness of them. Just sitting in the posture of someone who has finally arrived at a place they have been traveling toward for a long time and found it both exactly what they expected and entirely different. He crossed the room and sat in the other chair, the one across from hers, which faced the bookshelf rather than the garden. He said nothing. The room was quiet, in the way that houses are quiet when they've been closed up, full of the particular silence of stored time. After a while, she took her hands away from her face. Her eyes were dry. She looked at the garden through the window, bare and honest in the November light, showing its structure without any softening. He knew he was in danger, she said. He was building the case. He gave Roland the documents. He called Simone. He was doing everything right. She paused. And it wasn't enough. He ran out of time, Mason said. Yes. She said it flatly. Not acceptance, exactly. Something rougher than that. The acknowledgement of a fact that she had not yet made peace with and might not for a long time. He ran out of time because the person he trusted most decided that his own financial comfort was worth more than my father's life. Mason said, "The case will be complete. Vaughn will be prosecuted. The full record of what happened will be established." "I know." She turned from the window. "It won't bring him back." "No," Mason said. "It won't." He did not try to make that better. It was not a thing that could be made better, and she did not need it to be. She needed it to be acknowledged accurately, which was different, and which was the thing he could give her without pretending. She looked at him for a moment. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. "When I hired you, what did you think I was?" "A driver." She said it without apology. "Good at your job, quiet, reliable. Someone I didn't need to think about because the logistics managed themselves." She glanced at the photograph of young Ava playing chess. "My father's lawyers handled the hire. I approved the background check. I didn't ask questions because I had other things to manage." "That's how most employment relationships work," Mason said. "I know, but..." She stopped, and he had learned enough of her rhythms by now to know that the stops were not hesitation, but selection. She was choosing between several things she could say and finding the right one. "You crossed a ballroom to save my life when you had every reason not to. You drove me to Roland Fitch's house 2 days after being discharged from the hospital. You called in professional favors to trace a financial transfer. You stood in a hallway at Alderton's for 45 minutes and then walked through a door at exactly the right moment." She looked at him steadily. "None of that is in the job description." "The job description was narrow," Mason said. "Why didn't you stay inside it?" He thought about this. The honest answer was not simple, and he had been avoiding examining it closely because close examination had a way of producing conclusions that rearranged things. But they were sitting in her father's study on a Saturday in November, and the distance he had maintained between this job and the professional habits of his previous life had already been fully compromised, and the question deserved something real. "I don't know how to watch a threat develop and not respond to it," he said. "I tried to leave that behind when I left the previous work. I thought I had, mostly." He paused. "And you?" He stopped. "And I?" she said quietly. "You're worth the effort," he said. It came out simpler than he'd intended, stripped of the qualifications he'd been reaching for. He watched her receive it, the slight shift in her expression, something opening that she did not immediately close. The house was very quiet around them. The garden through the window was still and gray and honest. Somewhere in the house, a pipe made the sound that old pipes make when the heat comes on, a clunk, and then a steady, comfortable hiss. "He would have liked you," Ava said. She looked at her father's desk, the coffee mug with the pens, the frowning photograph of 13-year-old Ava losing a chess game she had clearly not planned to lose. He had very specific opinions about people. He used to say you could tell more about a person from what they did when no one was watching than from anything they said when everyone was. She stopped. "You didn't know anyone was watching at the Hargrove Grand." "I knew you were there," Mason said. "I was the person you were saving. That doesn't count as watching." "No," he agreed. "I suppose it doesn't." She stood up from the chair, not abruptly, but with the movement of someone who has sat still long enough and needed to be in motion again. She went to the desk and stood in front of it, looking at the papers her father had left behind. She picked up the chess photograph, held it for a moment, set it back down. "I lost that game," she said. "He let me win the first 3 times we played. When I figured out he was doing it, I was furious. We didn't speak for 2 days. She traced the edge of the frame with one finger. Then he sat back down across from me and played his actual game. I lost in 11 moves. A pause. I didn't speak to him for another 2 days. Then I made him teach me everything he knew. Did you ever beat him? 3 times, legitimately. She picked up the photograph and placed it in her bag, carefully, the way you handle something you are taking responsibility for. I was going to beat him a 4th time the summer he died. We had a standing game every Sunday. I had him in 6 moves if he'd made the mistake I was setting up for. She looked at the bag. He probably saw it coming. He always saw things coming. The grief was present in the room now. Not overwhelming, but real. The kind that settles in when the person who has been carrying it finally gives it the space it's been asking for. It had a specific texture, different from the anger and the urgency that had organized the past 3 weeks. Slower, more personal. The grief not of a CEO whose company had been stolen from, but of a daughter who had been eating Sunday dinners with a man she loved and had not known there would be a last one. Mason gave it room. He sat in the chair and let her have the study without trying to move the moment along, because some moments needed to be fully occupied rather than transitioned out of. After a while, she said, "We should lock up." "When you're ready." She looked around the room one more time. The bookshelves, the desk, the garden. Whatever she was doing with that look was private, and he did not try to read it. Then she moved toward the door, and he followed. In the hallway, she stopped at one of the photographs he had not allowed himself to look at earlier. It showed a much younger Richard Whitmore holding an infant, both of them looking at the camera with the slightly dazed expression of people who have just been changed by something and haven't yet figured out how. The infant was looking slightly to the left of the lens, at something the camera hadn't captured. 3 weeks old, Ava said. He used to say he had no idea what he was doing, that he just picked me up when I cried and hoped for the best. She looked at the photograph a moment longer. He figured it out. They walked to the car in the pale November light. The garden was quiet on either side of the stone path, the bare plants showing their careful structure, the shapes that remained when the seasonal decoration was gone. Mason unlocked the car and they got in. He did not start the engine immediately. "Simone Adler," Ava said, "when this is over, when the investigation has what it needs and the company is stable, I want to offer her a senior position in the compliance department, a real one, with actual authority over reporting, one that can't be suppressed." "She's earned it," Mason said. "Yes." Ava looked out the window at the house. "And Roland Fitch deserves an acknowledgement, not just a private thank you, something formal. His name on the record as someone who did the right thing even when it was difficult and late." Mason started the engine. "What about Peter Holloway?" "His cooperation will be factored in by the prosecutors. That's their decision, not mine. But he won't be returning to the company." She said this without heat. Matter of fact, the decision of someone who has thought it through and reached a clean conclusion. There are going to be significant internal reforms, oversight structures that should have existed before, reporting channels that don't root through single points of failure. She was looking at the road now, the logic of it working itself out in her voice. My father built something worth preserving. I intend to preserve it, but differently than he did, with the structures that protect it from the inside, not just the reputation that protects it from the outside. That's the right approach, Mason said. It's what he was trying to get to, she said, before he ran out of time. A pause. I have more time. I intend to use it correctly. He drove. The road out of Whitfield moved through the same spare November landscape as the drive in, but he noticed it differently on the return. The bare trees had a clarity to them that the overcast morning had muted, and the sky had lifted slightly in the early afternoon, admitting a thin, genuine light. Halfway back to the city, Ava said, Ella asked me if I liked cats. Mason kept his eyes on the road. When? The morning at the hospital, before she and Mrs. Henshaw left for pancakes. She asked me quietly while you were talking to Mrs. Henshaw. Just very seriously, out of nowhere. Do you like cats? What did you say? I said yes. She nodded and said she was working on her father. A pause. I assume that means she wants a cat. She's been working on me about a cat for 8 months, Mason said. The answer is still no. Why? Because I'm also responsible for feeding and caring for it, which she has not factored into her campaign. Ava looked at him. She's 7. She's 7 and extremely persistent, Mason said. If I agree to the cat will be named something completely impractical and will sleep on my side of the bed. You have a side of the bed? Everyone has a side of the bed, Mason said. The left side. The cat will sleep on the left side. Ava was quiet for a moment, then, she asked me to put in a good word. She recruited you. She was very diplomatic about it. She said, Ava's voice carried the controlled quality of someone not quite successfully suppressing something, that you sometimes said no to things that turned out to be good ideas. Mason said nothing for a moment. She said that. More or less, she was 7, so it came out slightly differently, but that was the substance. He drove. The city appeared ahead of them, the familiar skyline resolving out of the gray afternoon, specific and unglamorous and real. He had driven toward it thousands of times, from dozens of different directions, in different years and different circumstances, and it had always looked like the same city. Today it looked slightly different. He could not have said exactly why. I'm not getting a cat, he said. Of course not, Ava said. She looked at the skyline. Probably. He looked at her. She was not quite smiling. He looked back at the road. The city received them without fanfare, the way cities do, swallowing them into traffic and streetlights and the accumulated ordinary motion of a Saturday afternoon. They drove through it, and he took her to her building, and she got out, and this time she did not pause at the door. She turned and looked at him through the open window. Monday, she said, Hargrove's team needs us at 8. I'll be there at 7:30, he said. She nodded. She started to turn. Then she stopped, and for just a moment, standing on the sidewalk outside her building in the late afternoon with the city moving around her, she looked like exactly what she was. A 30-year-old woman who had been through a great deal in a short time, was still standing, and was figuring out what came next with the same methodical determination she brought to everything. Thank you, she said. For Whitfield. Any time, he said. He meant it in the broadest sense. Not just Whitfield, but the whole accumulated thing that had no clean name. She heard it that way, he thought. She went inside. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the car, in the mid-afternoon city sounds, and thought about Ella, who was at Mrs. Henshaw's apartment eating things that were probably not good for her, and watching something on television that was definitely not educational, and describing to Mrs. Henshaw in exhaustive detail the plot of the story she had written for school, which was not fictional. He pulled out his phone and sent her a text. Coming to get you in an hour. How are the cookies? Her reply came back in 40 seconds. So good. Also, Mrs. H says you look thin again. Also, Dad, can we get a cat? He put the phone in his pocket and started the car. The case against Gerald Vaughn was already moving through its processes. The slow, necessary machinery of law doing what it did, imperfect and essential. The company Ava had inherited was going to be restructured and strengthened, and in time, reflect the better version of what her father had built. Simone Adler would have a real job with real authority. Roland Fitch would have his name on the right side of the record. The man who had swapped the champagne glass at the Hargrove Grand would be found eventually, because these things were found eventually when the investigation had enough threads to pull. The loose ends would resolve. The story would become the record. And on a Saturday afternoon in November, a single father drove across a city he knew well toward a 7-year-old who was going to ask him about the cat again, and thought that the world, imperfect and impersonal and frequently terrible in the specific ways it chose to be, was also, sometimes, quietly worth the trouble of staying in it. He drove. The lights changed. The city moved around him, indifferent and alive. The trial date was set for the following March, which gave the prosecution 4 months to build a case that Christine Hargrove described, in the measured language of someone who did not make promises she couldn't keep, as among the most comprehensively documented financial crime prosecutions she had handled in 30 years. Gerald Vaughn's legal team entered a not guilty plea, which surprised no one. What surprised people, the small circle of people who knew the full shape of what had happened, was how quickly the defense posture began to erode once the evidence disclosure process began and Vaughn's attorneys understood the scope of what they were working against. A recorded confession was one thing. A recorded confession supported by 7 years of documented financial transactions, 2 cooperating witnesses, an independent forensic accounting analysis, and an international paper trail connecting a $380,000 payment to the arranged death of a 61-year-old man was something categorically different. By December, Vaughn's legal team had made an approach to Hargrove about a potential agreement. Hargrove's response, relayed through appropriate channels, was that the government was prepared to proceed to trial and was confident in the outcome, but would hear what the defense had to offer. What they offered, in a series of carefully managed conversations over 3 weeks, was a full cooperation agreement. Every detail of the financial structure, every intermediary, every arrangement, in exchange for a negotiated sentence rather than the full exposure of a jury trial. Hargrove brought this to Ava in January in the glass-walled conference room on the 48th floor, where the financial documents had once been spread across the table and were now filed in a federal evidence repository. "The cooperation gives us the contractor," Hargrove said. "The full chain. Everything we don't already have documented." She set her reading glasses on the table. The sentence negotiation would result in significantly less than the maximum exposure, but it would still be substantial. He would not be a free man for a very long time. Ava sat across from her. She had her hands flat on the table, which was the posture she adopted when she was thinking carefully and did not want her body to give the thinking away before she was finished with it. "Does the full cooperation close all the open threads?" "The contractor has already been located," Hargrove said. "He's been in custody in another jurisdiction for an unrelated matter since November, which is partly why the case against him was moving anyway. With Vaughn's full cooperation, we close the connection to your father's death completely. We also identify the individual who entered the Hargrove Grand Gala with false credentials." She paused. "He's a man named Curtis Webb. He was found in February in connection with a separate investigation. The cooperation agreement brings him into this case formally." Ava looked at the window. The January sky outside was the particular flat white of a winter overcast, pressing down on the city without quite becoming snow. She looked at it for a long moment. "He admitted what he did," she said. "In that room at Alderton's. He said it out loud, and he knew I heard it." She brought her eyes back to Hargrove. "I don't need a trial for my own satisfaction. The record exists. The truth is documented." She paused. "Accept the agreement. Get every piece of information he has, lock it into the official record, and make sure the sentence is one he lives with for long enough that it means something." Hargrove nodded once. "That's my recommendation as well." "Then we're aligned," Ava said. She picked up her pen and made a note on the legal pad in front of her. A habit Mason had noticed. She used to make decisions feel real rather than abstract. Writing a thing down was her version of committing to it. "What about the recovered funds?" "The forensic accountants have traced and frozen approximately $13.8 million across the various accounts and structures. Recovery proceedings are underway. It won't be fast. These jurisdictions cooperate, but on their own schedules. Hargrove allowed herself a small, dry expression. Think of it as interest accruing in your favor. I'm not interested in the money, Ava said. I'm interested in it not being his anymore. In that case, Hargrove said, consider it already not his. The cooperation agreement was finalized in the third week of January. Gerald Vaughn entered a formal guilty plea on 4 counts: financial fraud, conspiracy, accessory to murder in the first degree, and conspiracy to commit murder. The plea was entered in a federal courtroom on a Tuesday morning that was so ordinary in every other respect: gray sky, cold, the smell of the building's old heating system, that it felt slightly wrong, the way consequential things sometimes feel wrong when the stage they happen on is unremarkable. Ava was in the courtroom. She sat in the third row with Christine Hargrove to her left and an empty seat to her right, because Mason was in the hallway. She had asked him to come, and he had come. And then she had told him she thought she needed to be in the room alone for this particular part. And he had said he understood and meant it, and had found a bench in the corridor outside and sat there for 40 minutes with a coffee that cooled to undrinkable and a newspaper he did not read. When she came out, she looked like someone who had just finished running a very long race, not broken, not triumphant, but completed. The particular exhaustion of having gotten to the end of something. She sat down next to him on the bench. Done? He said. Done, she said. They sat for a moment in the corridor of the federal building, which smelled like every federal building Mason had ever been in. Cleaning solution and old carpet, and the specific institutional air of a place that processed serious things in deliberately unsensational surroundings. Someone walked past pushing a mail cart. A door closed somewhere down the hall. How do you feel? He asked. She thought about this in the way she thought about most things, fully, without rushing to the answer just because the question was simple. Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a long time, she said, and I just put it down, and now I'm not sure what to do with my hands. He understood this exactly. He had felt it himself years ago in a different context. The particular disorientation of completing something that has organized so much of your mental and emotional energy that its absence creates a shape. The shape of what was there, outlined by what isn't anymore. That feeling passes, he said. I know. She looked at her hands briefly, with the expression of someone checking whether the metaphor had been literal. Then she looked up. Simone Adler starts her new role on the 1st of February, head of independent compliance oversight. I had the position created specifically. She'll report directly to the board, not through any operational chain. She said this with the satisfaction of someone checking an item off a list that has been a long time in the making. Roland Fitch has been formally acknowledged in the company's public statement about the investigation. His name is in the record. Good, Mason said. Peter Holloway's cooperation reduced his criminal exposure. He won't face prosecution. He also won't work in financial oversight again, or in this company, or in any company whose board I have any influence over. She said this without drama. Clean and final. His career in this industry is over. That's the correct outcome. Mason said nothing. He agreed. She turned to look at him. I want to talk to you about something. He had learned, over the past 3 months, that this particular opening from Ava meant she had been thinking about the thing for a while and had decided it was time, which meant she was ready and the conversation was going to be direct. He turned slightly toward her on the bench. All right. The company needs a head of security, she said. A real one. Not the contracted firm we've been using, which is adequate for building access and event coverage, but has no institutional knowledge and no loyalty to the organization. She held his gaze. I want someone who understands risk from the inside, who can build a security structure that actually protects the people and assets involved rather than managing the appearance of protection. She paused one beat. I want you. Mason was quiet for a moment. The mail cart went past again in the other direction. That's a significant position, he said. Yes. It's different from driving. Considerably, she said. It comes with a corresponding compensation structure. You would have a team, you would have real operational authority over security decisions. She said the next part without inflection. You would also have consistent hours, which I'm aware matters for other reasons. He looked at the corridor floor. He thought about Ella, who was in school right now, probably in the middle of a math lesson she would describe to him tonight, with the particular mixture of competence and complaint that she brought to anything she was both good at and resistant to. He thought about the apartment and the school district and the park 3 blocks away. He thought about 8 years of a previous life that he had walked away from and had, over the past 3 months, partially walked back toward, not all the way, but far enough to know that the skills were still there and that using them for something that mattered felt different from leaving them behind. He thought about a ballroom and a champagne glass, and a decision made in 3 seconds that had unraveled everything and reorganized it into something he had not expected. "Can I have a week?" he said. "You can have whatever you need," she said. "But yes, a week is fine." He nodded. She nodded. They stood up from the bench in the corridor of the federal building and walked out into the January cold, which hit with the honest indifference of January, and the city received them back into its motion without ceremony. He took 6 days, not 7. He spent the first 2 days simply carrying the question around without trying to answer it, which was how he made decisions that mattered, not by deliberating continuously, but by letting the question exist alongside ordinary life and seeing what it looked like in different contexts. He thought about it while driving Ella to school. He thought about it while buying groceries and while running on Saturday morning and while watching Ella draw at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoon, her tongue between her teeth in concentration, producing a horse that was technically incorrect in every proportion and entirely recognizable as a horse. On the 3rd day, he called Dana Priest in Washington. She was in a meeting but called him back in 20 minutes, which told him that she had seen the caller ID and made a decision about priorities. "The Whitmore case," she said, by way of greeting. "It's resolved," he said. "I saw. Guilty plea. Full cooperation." A pause. "You did good work, Mason." "I had help," he said. "That's usually how it goes." Another pause. "You calling to tell me that, or is there something else?" "I've been offered a position," he said, "head of security for a major corporation, building the structure from scratch." Dana was quiet for a moment. "Is this the same corporation?" "Yes." "And the offer is from—" "Yes." A longer pause. He could hear her thinking through the phone, or rather, he could hear the quality of silence that meant she was thinking and choosing her words with the care she brought to most things. "How do you feel about it?" "I don't know yet," he said. "That's partly why I'm calling. What does Ella think?" "I haven't told her the specifics." "Mason." Dana's voice had the specific tone she used when she thought he was making a mistake that she intended to correct without telling him directly what the correction was. "You left the previous work because Ella needed you present. That was the right call. This sounds like it would keep you present and also use what you're actually good at, with stable hours, for an organization you've already proven you're willing to risk your life for." A pause. "What exactly is the question?" He thought about this. Whether it changes something that doesn't need to be changed. What doesn't need to be changed? He didn't answer immediately. Dana waited him out, which she was good at. "There's a version of this," he said finally, "where taking the job means something beyond the job. And I'm not sure I know how to navigate that." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mason, you kissed your employer in front of 500 people to save her life and nearly died from it. I think whatever is or isn't navigable between you two, you're already past the professional boundary you're worried about crossing." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair point." "I make fair points," she said. "Take the job. Take care of Ella. And don't overthink the rest of it. It'll sort itself out or it won't. And worrying about it in advance won't change which one it is." He thanked her and ended the call and sat in the kitchen for a while with his coffee, looking at the window above the sink, through which the January sky was doing its flat gray best. On the 5th day, he told Ella, not about the job offer specifically, he told her that he was thinking about changing what he did at work, that instead of driving, he would be doing something closer to what he used to do, which involved keeping people safe. She listened to this with the focused attention of a child who has learned that when adults explain things carefully, it is because the thing matters. "Like a bodyguard?" she said. More like building a team of people who make sure a whole organization is safe. She considered this. Is it for Ava? He looked at her. Why would you think that? Because that's your job. With her. She said this with the reasonable certainty of a 7-year-old who had decided what the situation was and found the adult's uncertainty about it vaguely exasperating. Also, she came to my school thing. He had not known this. What school thing? The reading assembly, last Tuesday. She was in the back. She waved. Ella returned to the horse she was drawing, at Sos. A new one, slightly better proportioned. I think she's nice. She laughed at my story. Mason stopped. You performed your story at the assembly? They asked for volunteers, Ella said, with the serenity of someone who does not understand why this would be surprising. It's a good story. He thought about Ava standing in the back of a second-grade reading assembly on a Tuesday afternoon, watching a 7-year-old read a story about a driver who saved a princess from a poisoned cup, and waving. He thought about the kind of person who does that. Not as a gesture, not because it was noticed, but because she had heard about the assembly and showed up. On the 6th day, he called Ava and accepted the position. February arrived with the specific quality of a month that knows it is not quite winter, and not quite anything else yet. Cold and gray and occasional, with brief intervals of weak sun that felt generous despite producing almost no warmth. The city moved through it with the patient resignation of people who have been through enough Februaries to know that the enduring of it is most of the work. Mason started the new position on the first Monday of the month. He spent the first 2 weeks in assessment mode, walking the building's current security infrastructure with the attention of someone looking for the gap between how a thing presents and how it actually functions. He found several. He documented them without drama and began the process of addressing them systematically, hiring 2 additional personnel, restructuring the access protocols for the executive floor, and establishing the independent reporting lines that bypassed the operational chain entirely. It was work he was good at, not in the performing for an audience way, but in the quieter way of someone who understands a problem and knows how to disassemble it correctly. He came home at reasonable hours. He drove Ella to school in the mornings and was there to pick her up most afternoons. And the rhythm of it, the school, the work, the apartment, the particular recurring texture of a life organized around a child's schedule, felt steadier than it had in months. Ella noticed. She did not say so directly, because she was 7 and direct emotional observation was not her primary language, but she started leaving her drawings on the kitchen counter for him to find, which she did when she was happy. A habit she had developed so gradually that he had not noticed it until Mrs. Henshaw pointed it out once, and he had thought about it for a while afterward. Simone Adler, in her new role, turned out to be exactly what Roland Fitch's description of her had suggested, a person who was either very brave or didn't understand how dangerous the situation was, and who, when the danger was removed, redirected all of that same energy into building the oversight structures with the methodical determination of someone who had been trying to build them for 6 years and was finally in a room where the doors weren't being closed on her. She and Mason developed a working relationship built on mutual recognition, 2 people who had been trying to do the right thing in an environment designed to make that difficult, and who were now, improbably, in a position to make the environment different. Your father's instincts about people were good, Mason told Ava in March, after a joint meeting with Simone about the new compliance reporting protocols. Ava looked up from the document she was reading. He chose Gerald Vaughn. He trusted someone who was trustworthy for 20 years and then changed, Mason said. That's different from bad instincts about people. That's the specific difficulty of the way people can change slowly, in ways that don't show until they do. She looked at him for a moment. That's more generous than I've been able to be about it. You're allowed to be less generous. He was your father. She returned to the document. But something in her posture had eased, fractionally, the way it did when a thing she had been holding tightly was given a slightly different shape and turned out to fit better that way. The trial, the sentencing phase of the cooperation agreement, took place in late March, in the same federal courtroom where the guilty plea had been entered. The proceedings were, by design, procedural rather than dramatic. The documentation of sentence, the formal entry of the cooperation record, the closing of the official case. Gerald Vaughan appeared in a suit that fit differently than it had at Alderton's. Some quality of carriage had gone out of him in the months between, the particular posture of a man who has been powerful for so long that the power had become structural, and without it the structure was visible in its absence. He looked older. He looked, Mason thought, like what he was, a man who had made a calculation about what he was worth and had been wrong about the math. The sentence was 22 years. With the cooperation agreement, it was subject to review at the 14-year mark. He would be 77 years old at the earliest possible release. Ava heard the sentence read and sat with it for a moment without moving. Then she gathered her things and stood up and walked out of the courtroom into the corridor, where Mason was waiting on the same bench they had sat on in January. She sat down. 22 years, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the courthouse's high windows let in a pale March light that was noticeably different from the January kind. Still thin, but with something behind it now, the particular quality of light that carries the suggestion of the season ahead. It won't feel like enough eventually, she said. I know that. Some part of me will always think it's not enough. She looked at her hands. But it's what the law provides. And the law is how we do this so that it means something beyond personal satisfaction. Your father would agree with that, Mason said. Yes. Something moved across her face. He was infuriatingly principled about the rule of law, even when it frustrated him. She paused. Especially then, actually. They sat for a moment in the corridor's institutional quiet. The recovered funds, Ava said. 13.8 million, when the recovery proceedings complete. I've decided what to do with it. But She had the look she got when she had been thinking about something for a long time and was finally saying it out loud. A foundation, in my father's name, focused on financial transparency and corporate accountability, funding independent oversight research, supporting whistleblowers who need legal resources, providing the kind of structural support that someone like Simone Adler shouldn't have had to manage alone for 6 years. She paused. It turns the money into something he would have wanted to exist. Mason thought about this. About a man who had done manual ledger reviews because he believed the numbers told you things the summaries hid. About a man who had built something over 30 years and been killed for refusing to compromise it. About the specific kind of principled stubbornness that was, depending on your position, either the most admirable or the most inconvenient quality a person could have. That's exactly right, Mason said. That's exactly what to do with it. Ava looked at him. Something in her expression was open in a way that she was no longer trying to manage. Over the past 4 months, the careful distance she had maintained, the professional architecture of employer and employee, the efficient courtesy that kept things ordered, had been gradually, incrementally, and largely unavoidably dismantled. Not all at once, not with any single dramatic moment, just through the accumulated weight of shared difficulty and honest conversation and the specific intimacy of two people who had been through something real together and had stopped pretending they were still strangers. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, he said. When you saw the waiter at the Hargrove Grand, when you realized what was happening, were you afraid? He thought about this honestly. Not in the moment. The moment was too immediate for fear. It was afterward, in the car, when the symptoms were clear and I understood what I'd taken in. He paused. I thought about Ella. That was what I was afraid of. Not for myself, but for her. That she'd lose another parent. Ava was quiet. What did that feel like? Like the clearest possible reminder of what matters, he said, which is sometimes what fear is useful for. She looked at him for a long moment. The direct measuring look she had turned on the financial documents in those first days, the same focus applied to something that required different instruments. You matter, she said, not because of what you did at the gala, because of who you are when nobody's watching. She said it simply, without building up to it. I want you to know that I see that. The courthouse corridor was quiet around them. The March light came through the high windows and fell across the old floor in rectangles that would move slowly through the afternoon. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. The mail cart did not appear. Mason looked at her. He thought about clean lines and the ways they stopped being enough. He thought about the version of himself that had built a careful, bounded life. and the version that was sitting on a bench in a federal courthouse, having apparently crossed every boundary he had set for himself so thoroughly that the original boundaries were no longer visible from here. He thought that this was, on balance, not a bad place to end up. "I know," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not the beginning of a speech. It was just 2 words, said with the steadiness of someone who meant them completely and did not need to elaborate them into something more than they were. She heard them exactly right. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early April, Ava came for dinner. Not a planned dinner, not an organized occasion. Ella had demanded it, in the direct manner of a child who has decided what she wants and sees no compelling reason why the adults around her should not arrange it. She had been lobbying for it, in escalating terms, since February, and Mason had been managing the lobbying with the techniques available to him, which were limited, because Ella's techniques were fundamentally better than his, and she had the advantage of time and persistence on her side. The dinner was pasta, because Ella had insisted on cooking and pasta was within her competency, with supervision. Mason had provided the supervision and done the parts that required handling hot water, and the result was something that was approximately correct and had been accompanied by a commentary from Ella about each ingredient that was so detailed and confident that it created the impression of expert culinary knowledge regardless of the technical execution. Ava arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of good wine for Mason and a book about horses for Ella, which was received with the particular reverence that Ella reserved for things that confirmed her deepest interests. She sat at the kitchen table while Mason finished the sauce, and Ella explained to her at length the various reasons why horses were superior to other animals, a topic on which she had developed sophisticated positions over several years of dedicated thought. "They're very fast," Ella said, "but that's not the main reason." "What's the main reason?" Ava asked. She was paying full attention, not the polite attention of an adult managing a child's conversation, but genuine focus, the kind that Ella, with her fine-tuned radar for these things, recognized and responded to. "They remember things," Ella said, "like forever. If you're kind to a horse, they remember. And if someone is bad to them, they remember that too." She considered this. "I think that's important. Remembering." "I think so too," Ava said. Ella looked at her with the evaluating eye she occasionally turned on people when she was deciding something. "My dad remembers everything," she said. "He remembered that waiter at the party. He noticed him and remembered, and that's why he—" She glanced at Mason. "Saved the day." "He did save the day," Ava said. "He's embarrassed when I say that," Ella said, with the cheerful frankness of someone who finds this endearing rather than concerning. "He doesn't like being called a hero." "Most people who actually are don't," Ava said. Mason, at the stove, said nothing. He stirred the sauce and looked out the window above the sink at the April evening, which was doing something genuinely warm for the first time since November. A softness in the air, the trees on the street showing the first tentative green of new leaves, everything suggesting that the season had made a decision. They ate at the kitchen table, which was slightly too small for 3, and had accumulated the particular character of a surface that had been used for homework and drawings and newspapers, and recently the occasional work document, and had absorbed all of it into its grain. Ella ate with the focused efficiency of someone fueling up for further activity, asked Ava 14 questions about what it was like to run a company, some sophisticated, some completely off topic, all of them genuine, and then, with the abrupt subject change of a child who has decided the current topic is complete, said, "Dad, can we ask Ava about the cat?" Mason set down his fork. "Ella." "It's a good time," she said reasonably. "It is not a good time." "It's dinner," she said. "We're all here. It's the perfect time." She turned to Ava with the smooth, diplomatic pivot of someone who has identified the most useful ally in the room. "We want a cat. Dad says no. I think you would say yes if someone else agreed it was a good idea." Ava looked at Mason. Mason looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at his pasta. "I have been advised," Ava said with the careful neutrality of someone genuinely trying not to influence the outcome, "that this is an ongoing discussion, and I don't think I should—" "It would be good for Dad," Ella said. "He works a lot. A cat is company." "I have company," Mason said. "I have you." "I'm at school most of the day," Ella said. "A cat would be there when I'm not." This was, Mason recognized with the resignation of a parent who has been outmaneuvered by a 7-year-old, a completely coherent argument. He looked at Ava, who was doing something with her expression that he had learned to recognize as the thing she did when she was preventing herself from finding something funnier than she was prepared to admit in company. "I see," he said. "You don't have to decide tonight," Ella said, with the magnanimity of someone who feels confident about the eventual outcome. "Just think about it." "I've been thinking about it for 10 months, Mason said. "And you're getting closer," Ella said. "I can tell." After dinner, Ella showed Ava the horse book, page by page, with commentary, which occupied approximately 40 minutes, and which Ava attended with a patience that was not performed. She was genuinely interested, or had made herself genuinely interested, which in practice produced the same result. Mason washed the dishes and listened to them from the kitchen. The sound of Ella's confident narration, and Ava's questions and occasional laughter moving through the small apartment like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for its moment. At 8:30, Ella went to bed with the horse book and the specific negotiated arrangement of exactly 15 minutes of reading before lights out, which Mason enforced with the reliable consistency that she both resisted and, he suspected, depended on. He came back to the living room where Ava was sitting on the couch with her wine, looking at the drawings on the kitchen counter, the horses, the latest one, and a drawing from last week that showed 3 figures of varying heights, done in the unself-conscious style of a child who draws what she means rather than what she can technically achieve. The 3 figures had, respectively, dark curly hair, dark straight hair, and small round ears that were apparently a cat. "She's already decided," Ava said. "She decided 6 months ago," Mason said. He sat in the chair across from the couch, the one that faced the window. "She's just been executing the strategy." "Smart kid." "Terrifyingly," he said. He meant it entirely as a compliment. Ava looked at the drawings for a moment. Then she looked at him. The apartment was quiet, Ella's room closed, the April evening settling into full dark outside the window with the soft quality of a season that has finally committed. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want to say it clearly, not sideways." He waited. "I'm aware that the last 4 months have been professionally complex," she said, "and I'm aware that you are employed by me, which creates a dynamic that reasonable people would say requires caution. I'm not ignoring that." She held his gaze. "But I've been ignoring a lot of other things, and I've been doing it deliberately because it was simpler, and I'm not sure simple is what I want anymore." The window was showing the first stars of the April evening, faint and early, not yet confident. The street below was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. "What do you want?" Mason said. She looked at him with the directness that was her most essential quality, the thing that had been there from the beginning, even through all the professional architecture she had built around it. "I want to not pretend that what's here isn't here," she said. "I want to see what it is. Honestly, without either of us managing it into something more comfortable." Mason thought about Dana Priest on the phone, saying you're already past the professional boundary you're worried about crossing. He thought about Ella's drawing, 3 figures and a cat, arranged on the kitchen counter with the confident certainty of a 7-year-old who has already worked out the ending. He thought about a ballroom 4 months ago, and a decision made in 3 seconds and everything that had followed from it, the long chain of consequence and trust and honest conversation that had led to this apartment on an April evening with the wine and the drawings and the stars coming up outside the window. He thought that there was a version of himself, the version from 5 months ago, who would have said something careful here. Who would have found the right professional language to redirect the moment without closing it? Who would have protected the clean lines he had built, because clean lines were what kept everything ordered and safe? He thought that version of himself had been both right and wrong, in the specific way that protective habits are, built for real reasons, maintained past their necessity. "I'm not pretending," he said. "I haven't been for a while." She looked at him. Something in her expression settled into a different kind of quiet, not the careful quiet of managed composure, but the simpler quiet of someone who has said a hard thing and been heard clearly and is letting that be enough for now. She did not reach across the space between the chair and the couch. He did not move from the chair. The evening was new, and the beginning of things is not the same as the middle, and they were both people who understood the difference between a first step and an arrival. But the space between them was different than it had been. Acknowledged. Real. The kind of space that two people who have both been through enough to know the value of honesty can sit in without needing to collapse it before it's ready. "The foundation," she said after a while. "The one in my father's name. I've been thinking about the board structure. I want people on it who understand what real oversight means from the inside, not just the theory of it." She looked at him. "Will you consider being on the board?" He looked at her. "That's a very calculated change of subject." "Yes," she said, without apology. He thought about it. "I'll consider it." "Good." She set down her wine glass. "It'll give us a reason to argue about things other than work." "Do we argue about work?" "You told me last Tuesday that my security assessment timeline for the Singapore office was 2 weeks too optimistic." "It was." "It was," she agreed. "But the way you said it was direct," he said. "Direct," she agreed. "We argue about work." He thought about this and found, to his mild surprise, that this was one of his favorite things about how they functioned. Not the arguing exactly, but the fact that neither of them softened things into shapes that were easier to manage at the expense of being accurate. It was, in the cold and practical view, the basis on which everything else was built. She stood up to leave at 9:15, which was not late but was later than he had expected, and she got her coat from the hook by the door, and he walked her to the door in the way of someone who has been through enough with another person that the ordinary gestures of hospitality carry more weight than they do between strangers. At the door, she stopped. "Tell Ella I like the pasta." "She'll want that in writing," he said. "I'll send a formal letter," Ava said. A pause. "And tell her—" She stopped, and the pause had a different quality than the one she used for selecting words. This one slightly less managed, slightly more human. That the 3-figure drawing on the counter is very good. The proportions on the middle figure are accurate. The middle figure was Ava. He had not told her that. She had figured it out herself, which was, he thought, characteristic. "I'll tell her," he said. She left. He stood in the open doorway for a moment and listened to her footsteps on the stairs and the sound of the building's front door opening and closing, and then the quiet that followed. He closed his own door and stood in the apartment in the silence that the evening had become. Ella was asleep in her room with the horse book. The drawings were on the kitchen counter. The wine glasses were on the coffee table, 2 of them, one empty and one with a small amount left. The window showed the April night, fully dark now, with the city's ambient light turning the sky that particular amber that city skies turn, and the first real stars visible in the clear patches above. People ask sometimes what it means to be saved. They expect the answer to be a single moment. Dramatic, clear, the kind you can point to. The night at the Hargrove Grand had been that kind of moment, or at least it had looked like one from the outside. One person sees a danger and crosses a room and does a thing that costs them something, and another person doesn't drink what would have killed them. But that's only the beginning of what saving actually looks like. The real saving happened slower. It happened in an 11-day investigation at a conference table. It happened in a hospital corridor and a study in Whitfield and a courthouse bench in January. It happened in 11 months of clean lines that bent, gradually, into the honest acknowledgement that the person behind the lines was more important than the lines themselves. A man who had learned to make himself invisible discovered that the right person could see him anyway. A woman who had been taught that strength meant carrying everything alone discovered that trust was not a weakness, but a different kind of structure. One that held more weight, not less, because it was shared. And a 7-year-old who drew 3 figures and a cat on a piece of paper, with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided what the future looked like, was not wrong about the proportions. Mason turned off the kitchen light. He checked the front door. He stood for a moment in the small, specific, imperfect space of his life. The apartment that was too small for 2 people and had been made to work. The park 3 blocks away. The school district. The drawings on the counter. The stars outside the window. And thought that this was, in every way that mattered, enough. More than enough. He went to bed. The city continued its ordinary, indifferent, necessary work outside. The April night did what April nights do. Move toward morning, carrying everything that had happened in it toward the new day, where it would still be true, but lighter. The way things that have been resolved feel lighter, not because they weigh less, but because you are no longer alone in carrying them. That, in the end, is the only rescue that matters. Not the dramatic crossing of a ballroom, but the slower, harder, more valuable kind. The kind where two people look at each other clearly, without managing what they see, and choose to stay in the room.